My truck was a 2009 Tacoma with a cracked dashboard and 212,000 miles on it. She groaned on the switchbacks like she was personally offended by inclines, which, fair enough. The bed was loaded with my kit, the laser distance measurer, the moisture sensors, the camera, the safety harness, a crowbar, a basic tool bag, 2 days of food and water, because I always carry 2 days when I go to remote sites. That habit came from a job in Arizona, where I got locked in a grain silo for 6 hours, waiting for the property manager to remember he'd hired me. 3 flashlights and a first aid kit. Standard setup. I wasn't planning to spend the night. I was going to spend 1 full day doing a structural assessment on the main lodge and the 3 outbuildings, photograph everything, take material samples where I could reach them safely, and write up a 30-page report telling Morrow and Tate whether there was enough sound timber, steel, or salvageable mechanical equipment to justify a demolition contract. It was October 23rd, a Tuesday. The sky was that specific shade of flat gray that the Cascades do in late autumn, like the whole atmosphere just gave up on having weather and settled for being vaguely overcast forever. Temperature was maybe 42 degrees when I got out of the truck at 8:15 in the morning, though there was a wind cutting through the trees that made it feel colder. The resort sat at 4,000 feet, which meant I was above most of the valley fog that had been sitting in the lowlands for the past 2 weeks. I could actually see things. The peaks above me still had snow from a system that had come through in early October, and it sat on the upper ridgelines in thin bands that looked almost decorative from down here, like someone had just run a white paint roller along the tops of the mountains. Creston Peak Resort, named for the peak that sat about 800 feet directly above the lodge, which you couldn't actually see from the parking lot because of the tree line. The name was still on the concrete gate posts at the entrance to the lot. One of the metal letters had fallen off the right post, so it read Creston Peak Resort, which felt about right for a place that had been abandoned for 7 years. The parking lot itself was cracked and heaving, where frost had worked its way under the asphalt over and over, winter after winter, doing the patient, slow destruction that freeze-thaw cycles do. Weeds had pushed through every crack. A few of them were surprisingly big, some kind of dock plant with thick reddish stems that had cracked their way right through 6 inches of asphalt like it was nothing. I stood next to one of them for a second and thought about what a structural engineer I used to work with, guy named Walt Durbin, always used to say, "Buildings don't rot, they get replaced. It's the ground that wins eventually. The ground and the plants and the water, always." I did a slow walk of the exterior before I went inside. That's habit, not procedure. The procedure says you can go straight in if the structural reports suggest the exterior is sound. But I've been doing this long enough to trust my feet more than reports. You walk the perimeter, you look at the roof line, you check the foundation exposure where it's visible. You look for cracks in the masonry, and you learn to read which ones are structural and which ones are cosmetic, and the difference between those 2 things is basically everything. The main lodge was a long, low building, 2 stories across most of its length, with a 3-story section in the center where the lobby and restaurant had been. It was built in a style I thought of as mountain institutional, heavy timber beams that you could see through the windows, stone facing on the lower third of the exterior, the upper portions done in vertical cedar siding that was now so weathered it had gone from whatever brown it started as to a kind of gray that matched the sky. The roof was a steep pitch to shed snow loads, and from what I could see, it had done its job. There were no obvious sag points or collapse sections, except on the far eastern end, which was the section that had been condemned. That part had a noticeable depression in the roofline above, where the avalanche debris had impacted the east wall. The wall itself had been shored up with temporary cribbing at some point, rough-cut timber supports that someone had put in place and then just left when the resort closed. The cribbing was still standing, which told me the people who put it in knew what they were doing. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. I wrote notes in my field notebook as I walked, page after page of numbers and observations, estimated concrete strength from visible aggregate exposure, rust bloom on the window lintel on the south side, which meant rebar corrosion and meant I needed to check that section carefully before I put any weight on anything in that area. The window glass was mostly intact, which surprised me. I'd expected more vandalism, but the resort was remote enough that casual vandals hadn't made it a regular stop. A few windows were broken, but most were just dirty, filmed with 7 years of pine pollen and dust, and the mineral deposits from rain running down across the glass. My phone showed 1 bar of signal on a good day up here, which meant it showed no bars about 70% of the time. That morning when I pulled it out to check the time, it showed no bars. That was normal. I put it back in my jacket pocket and didn't think about it. I went inside through the main entrance, which meant popping the padlock on the double doors with a combination Morrow and Tate had gotten from the county. The doors swung open with a groan that vibrated in my chest, the kind of sound that comes from hinges that have been static for years and resent being moved. Inside smelled the way all abandoned buildings smell, a specific combination of trapped cold air, mildew, old wood, and whatever the previous occupants left behind chemically. Ski lodges have their own version of this. Underneath everything, even after 7 years, there was still something that might have been ski wax or boot rubber, or just the particular smell of wet wool dried 1,000 times. I stood in the lobby for a minute and let my eyes adjust. The lobby was big, high ceiling. I estimated 22 feet to the ridge, with exposed timber trusses that were still in remarkable shape. The fireplace on the north wall was a riverstone structure, probably 8 feet wide at the face, and even in the dim October light coming through the dirty windows, you could see the quality of the stonework. Whoever built this place in 1971 didn't cut corners on the visible stuff. The floor was wide plank oak, warped in places from moisture cycles but structurally intact under my feet. I tested it every few steps. That's reflex, not paranoia. You push your heel down, feel for give, listen for the creak that tells you something's delaminating underneath. I spent the first 2 hours doing the ground floor systematically, working from the lobby through the restaurant space. Circular tables still set up, chairs stacked in the corners by whoever had done the final shutdown, a coating of gray dust on everything. The kitchen through a pair of swinging doors, stainless steel surfaces gone dull with oxidation, but still solid, industrial gas ranges, a walk-in cooler with the door propped open, empty, storage rooms off the kitchen, a ski rental shop at the far end of the ground floor, the racks empty except for 3 pairs of old skis someone had left behind, a first aid room, staff bathrooms, all of it cold and dim and silent in the particular way that abandoned buildings are silent. It's not the absence of sound exactly. It's more like sound is present, but everything you're hearing is wrong. The building is always making noise. Pings and ticks and low groans from the timber framing expanding and contracting in the temperature change as I let cold air in through the open front doors. The whistle of wind finding gaps in the siding. The particular creak of a floor joist that has developed a specific point of friction over years of thermal movement. Buildings talk. I've spent 15 years learning to listen. It was around 10:30 when I heard something that wasn't the building. I was in the second floor corridor above the restaurant, checking the ceiling joists with my flashlight, when I heard what I thought at first was distant thunder. Low, rolling, coming from the south. I went to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out, and I could see the valley below through a gap in the tree line. The valley where the town of Granger Creek sat. The nearest town, about 12 miles down the mountain by road, maybe 4 or 5 as the crow flies. The valley was hazy, the way it always was in October, but I could see something burning down there. Not a campfire or a controlled burn. Something big. There was a column of black smoke rising from the south part of town, and as I watched, another column started up near what I thought was the center. 2 fires burning simultaneously in a town of 3,000 people on a Tuesday morning. I took my phone out. No bars. I tried it anyway. Emergency calls only, the screen said. I tried 911 and got a recording that said the line was busy. I tried again. Same thing. The 911 line was busy. In my experience, that doesn't happen. The 911 system is built with redundancy, specifically to prevent that. You can have 100 calls happening simultaneously, and the system routes them. For it to return a busy signal meant the volume was so far beyond the design capacity that the whole thing was failing. I stood at that window for maybe 2 minutes, watching the smoke get bigger, and thinking about that in the quiet, methodical way I think about structural problems. What does this information mean? What are the possible explanations? What's the most likely scenario, and what do I need to do about it? The most likely scenario I came up with, standing there at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in an empty ski resort, watching two fires grow in the town below me, was some kind of industrial accident. Chemical plant, propane distributor, something. It happened. Towns and valleys had their industrial districts in the worst possible locations from a safety standpoint. And when something went wrong, it went wrong fast. The 911 system being jammed was consistent with a mass casualty incident. People calling, not getting through, calling again. What I should do, I decided, was finish the ground floor assessment, then try to drive down and check on the situation. If the road was blocked by emergency vehicles, I'd turn around and come back. If not, I'd get to somewhere with cell signal and figure out what was happening. I went back to work. For another hour and a half, I worked through the second floor, and then the partial basement level under the lodge's central section. The basement was a mechanical room mostly. The old boiler system, electrical panels, the snowmaking equipment infrastructure, storage, low ceiling, 7 feet, concrete block walls, concrete floor, with a drain in the center. My flashlight swept through the space and I did what I always did. I walked the perimeter, tapping walls, listening to the sound change. Solid concrete has one sound. Hollow block has another. Block with a cavity behind it has a third. I've been doing this long enough that my knuckles have a callus on the first joint from all the wall tapping. I was in the northeastern corner of the basement, crouched down looking at where the boiler's foundation met the slab floor. There was a crack that didn't look random. It had a curve to it that suggested something under the slab had shifted, when I heard the first scream. It came from outside, up close, not from the valley, maybe from the parking lot. I stood up fast enough that I whacked my head on a low-hanging pipe junction, and the sound of that was embarrassingly loud in the silence. I stood still and listened. The scream didn't repeat, but a second later, I heard what I can only describe as a kind of wet, rhythmic noise that I couldn't identify. Then a car alarm going off somewhere outside. Short bursts, then nothing. I went up the stairs from the basement to the main floor fast, taking them two at a time with my flashlight in my left hand and my crowbar in my right, which I want to be honest about. I didn't make a decision to grab the crowbar. I just had it in my hand when I hit the top of the stairs, which tells you something about what some part of my brain was already processing. I went through the kitchen to the window on the south side that looked out over the parking lot, and I looked out. There were two people in the parking lot. One of them was a woman in what looked like a waitress uniform, white button-down, black slacks, working shoes, and she was moving wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. She was moving like someone who is sleepwalking but moving fast. This lurching, off-balance gait where her head was lolling forward and she wasn't watching where she was going, just moving in a direction. The other person was a man in a canvas jacket, and he was on his back on the asphalt, and the woman in the waitress uniform was on top of him, and what she was doing to him, I couldn't process it. I watched for maybe 4 seconds, and my brain kept trying to file it as something normal, and couldn't. The man stopped moving. The woman in the waitress uniform raised her head and looked around. From where I was standing, I could see her face at maybe 40 feet. The window was dirty and the light was flat, but I could see her face. Something had happened to her eyes. They were wrong in a way I can't fully articulate. Open too wide, maybe, or focused on nothing, or both simultaneously. There was blood on the front of her uniform. A lot of it, not from a wound I could see on her, but transferred from the man on the ground. Her mouth was open slightly. She turned her head, slow and sweeping, like she was listening for something, and then she began to move again, this time toward the main entrance of the lodge. I stepped back from the window. My heart was going so fast it was making me mildly dizzy. Okay, think. What I had just watched, I didn't have a word for it in any category I trusted. I had a category for people in medical crisis. I had a category for violence. I had a category for accidents. What I'd just watched didn't fit any of them cleanly, and that category failure was the most frightening thing I'd experienced in a long time. When something doesn't fit a category, it means you don't know what the rules are. And when you don't know the rules, you can't predict behavior. And when you can't predict behavior, you can't plan. I moved through the kitchen to the restaurant space, staying low below the window line, and I went to the front of the lodge to look through the lobby windows at the entrance. The woman was about 30 feet from the double doors, still moving, still doing that lurching walk, and she was going to reach the doors in maybe 15 seconds. The doors I'd propped open when I came in, because I always prop them. I need the ventilation and the natural light when I'm working. I ran for the doors. I've spent a lot of time in buildings that are trying to kill me. Structurally compromised floors, unstable walls, asbestos clouds, spaces full of carbon monoxide from old equipment. And the thing you learn is that when your body tells you to run, you run first and think second. I got to the lobby doors and pulled them shut, and they swung together with a boom that shook dust off the lintel above me. There was a crossbar lock on the inside, just a wooden dowel that dropped into brackets, old-fashioned, probably original to the 1971 build, and I dropped it into place. Through the small window in one of the doors, I watched the woman reach the steps outside. She stopped at the base of the steps, looked up, tilted her head, made that sweeping listening motion again. Then she began to try to come up the steps, but her gait was so uncoordinated that the first step sent her stumbling sideways. She caught herself on the railing, tried again, got up the first step, then the second. It was taking her a long time, and there was something about watching it, the mechanical persistence of it, the complete absence of frustration or calculation on her face, that was worse than if she'd been running. I backed away from the door. My truck was in the parking lot. She had come from the direction of my truck. I didn't know if she'd come up the access road on foot or if she'd arrived in a vehicle of her own, but either way, the parking lot had her in it now, and she was between me and the only vehicle I had access to. I needed to think about whether there were other ways out. There weren't many. The building had the main entrance, a service entrance at the kitchen end of the building, and the loading dock on the north side. The service entrance also had an interior lock, not as solid as the main entrance, but it locked. The loading dock had a roll-up door that I'd already assessed as operational if slow, and a personnel door beside it that had a deadbolt. I went through the building checking all 3 secondary points and locking what I could lock, and barricading with the wheeled kitchen equipment what I couldn't fully lock. And I did it in about 8 minutes, moving fast, flashlight in my left hand, and my mouth dry, and my head very clear, in the way your head gets clear when adrenaline strips everything non-essential away. Then I went back to the kitchen and sat down on the cold tile floor with my back to the prep table, and I ate a granola bar from my jacket pocket and drank half a bottle of water, and I tried to think systematically about what was happening. This is what I knew. Something was wrong in the town below. There were fires. The 911 system was overloaded. There was at least one person in the parking lot who was behaving in a way that my brain flatly refused to categorize as anything I recognized. The man that woman had been, the man on the asphalt, was dead. I was almost certain he was dead. I didn't let myself think about what that meant yet, because thinking about what that meant was going to cost me processing capacity I needed for logistics. What I had, my truck, inaccessible, my field kit in the truck, including most of my food and water. What was on my person? My field notebook, my laser measurer, my phone with no signal, a pocket knife, a flashlight with fresh batteries, half a bottle of water, 2 granola bars, a pack of ibuprofen, and my crowbar. What was in the building? Whatever the kitchen had left in it, which, given that it had been closed for 7 years, was probably close to nothing perishable. Some equipment. What I'd seen in the ski rental shop. 3 pairs of skis and a rack with some hanging items I hadn't looked at closely. The woman in the parking lot was still out there. I could hear her sometimes. A low sound, not quite a moan, more like the sound of steady, unconsidered breathing made audible. She had found her way around the side of the building toward the service entrance, and had been at the service entrance door for a while, making that sound, before she drifted away. I tracked her movement by sound as well as I could. She seemed to be circling, slowly and without apparent pattern. Around noon, I was checking my watch constantly now. I heard more sounds outside. Not just her, others. Footsteps on the parking lot asphalt, more than one set. The particular deadfoot sound of someone not lifting their feet properly. Another sound underneath it, a group sound, a kind of low aggregate noise that I didn't have a word for. I went to the window in the east storeroom. It was small and high, and faced the parking lot, and I figured I was far enough above eye level to look out without being noticed, and I counted them. 7, 8. I got to 11 and stopped counting, because there were more coming through the gap in the trees at the south end of the lot, more of them coming up the access road, and the number didn't matter as much as the direction. They were moving into the parking lot. Several of them were going to my truck. One of them, a heavy-set man in a green fleece jacket, walked directly into the passenger side mirror of my truck and kept going as if the truck wasn't there, as if the impact had no meaning to him. The mirror snapped off and clattered to the asphalt, and the sound of it made every single head in the parking lot swivel in that direction simultaneously. This eerie, synchronized movement. And then they all began to move toward the sound. Some of them got there and began moving around the truck, bumping into each other, bumping into the truck, making those low sounds. I watched them from the window for 10 minutes. I was trying to understand the rules. They responded to sound, that was clear. The mirror hitting the asphalt had drawn every single one of them. They didn't seem to respond to visual stimulus at any range beyond maybe 10 or 15 feet. The woman who had approached the lodge hadn't been drawn by seeing me in the kitchen window. She'd already been moving in that direction. They weren't fast. None of them ran. They moved at walking pace or slower, and their coordination was poor, and they had no awareness of obstacles in their path. One of them walked off the edge of a low concrete wheel stop in the lot and fell face down on the asphalt and lay there for a second before slowly getting up. And the falling and getting up looked identical in expression and intent. None, zero, completely blank. What they were, I thought to myself as I crouched at that window, was an engineering problem. If you stripped away everything else, the horror of it, the question of how this was possible, the knowledge that these had been people this morning, what you had was a threat with identifiable behavioral parameters. They followed sound. They couldn't navigate obstacles well. They weren't fast. They weren't organized. They were, in the language of structural engineering, a load-bearing situation with known properties. You could design around a known load. You could not design around an unknown one. I needed to get to my truck, but I couldn't get to my truck, which meant I needed to work with what was in this building. And what I needed was time. Time to figure out what was happening. Whether it was happening everywhere or just here. Whether there was anyone coming to help, and what my options were. What I did for the next 2 hours was search the lodge. I did it quiet. That was the rule I set for myself immediately. Nothing makes noise unless I choose it. The crowbar got wrapped in a rag from the kitchen to stop the metal clank of it against door frames. I moved in socks on the hardwood floors, my boots hanging from my belt by the laces, not because I thought they could hear me up here through the walls, but because I was making a habit of it, building discipline around noise management, the way you'd build it around safety protocols on a job site. You don't wait until you're in danger to put on your hard hat. You wear it from the moment you walk onto the site. The kitchen was the first full search. Rationally, I knew it would be mostly empty. Health code regulations, when a food service establishment closes, require that all perishables and most non-perishables be removed. But there are always gaps between what regulations require and what actually happens during a closure, especially a rapid one. The resort had closed suddenly after the avalanche, and whoever had done the shutdown had done it in a hurry. I went through every cabinet, every drawer, every storage shelf, and I found 2 industrial cans of chicken broth, one of them with a dented seam that I set aside as potentially compromised, a half-empty box of kosher salt, 3 boxes of granulated sugar, sealed, still good, 2 bottles of canola oil, a sealed 5-gallon bucket of all-purpose flour that had been opened and resealed with a zip tie, a box of 36 individually wrapped sodium crackers, 6 cans of whole peeled tomatoes, all intact, 2 large cans of chickpeas, a bottle of vanilla extract, not food, but it had alcohol in it, which meant it had uses, 4 boxes of dried pasta, the kind in the cardboard box, and 2 of them had weevil damage visible through the box, but the other 2 looked okay. A first aid kit mounted inside a cabinet door that was larger than the one in my truck. Real supplies in it. Bandages, antiseptic, gauze rolls, a SAM splint, a space blanket folded in its foil packet. In the restaurant storage, I found tablecloths, napkins, candles, a lot of candles, the tall restaurant kind in glass cylinders, matches, a lighter, a sleeve of disposable propane canisters for the chafing dishes, and a box of individually portioned coffee pods that I looked at for a long moment before setting carefully aside. The ski shop gave me a rack of winter gear that someone had left, probably sample equipment or forgotten items. 2 fleece jackets, 1 men's large and 1 women's medium, both Patagonia, both in good shape. A ski patrol first aid pack hanging on the wall, bigger and more serious than the kitchen kit, with a SAM traction splint, an emergency blanket, more bandages, chemical heat packs, a tourniquet, a pair of thick wool ski socks, still in the packaging, ski goggles with a UV lens, which I almost passed up until I thought about wind and debris and took them, a fanny pack on one of the display hooks that contained a Leatherman multi-tool, a small compass, and a pack of waterproof matches. Whoever had left the fanny pack there had good taste in equipment. The equipment room adjacent to the ski shop, the room where rental skis were actually mounted and adjusted, had tools. A proper workbench with a pegboard above it holding screwdrivers, hex keys, wire, various hardware, ski binding adjustment tools, a bench vise, and, behind the workbench, a heavy-duty storage cabinet locked with a padlock that my crowbar opened in about 40 seconds, and inside, a full-sized fire extinguisher, still pressurized, a battery-powered LED lantern with fresh batteries, 3 pairs of work gloves, a box of road flares, and a hand radio, a 2-way NOAA compatible, with a belt clip, that when I turned it on, gave me the emergency broadcast tone and a voice reading a message that I had to press close to my ear to hear clearly. The message was a standard emergency broadcast format. It said, "Civil emergency in Granger Creek, Harlan, and Woodbridge counties. Citizens were directed to shelter in place. Avoid contact with individuals displaying signs of confusion, aggression, or impaired movement. Do not approach injured individuals. Emergency services were," and here the broadcast looped, so I don't know what emergency services were. It cut off right at that word and went back to the beginning. I sat on the workbench stool and listened to the loop 3 more times and thought about the phrase impaired movement. That was the phrase they chose, impaired movement. I thought about the woman in the parking lot, how she'd walked, that absence of coordination. I thought about the man in the green fleece jacket walking directly into the truck mirror. I thought about the synchronized head swivel when the sound happened. Then I thought about something else. I thought about that county inspector's handwritten note in the margin of the assessment report. Load-bearing anomaly, sub-basement, origin unclear. I'd been in the basement. I'd seen the boiler room. But I'd stopped my inspection when I heard the scream outside, and I hadn't finished the basement. It was something to do, a real thing to do, instead of sitting on a stool in a locked ski shop, listening to a loop of a broadcast that cut off before it could tell me what was happening. I needed to do something real and physical and investigative, and I had a question that the basement might be able to answer, and what structural engineers do, what I do, what I've done for 15 years, is go into the building and find out. I went back to the basement. Going down the stairs into the boiler room, I turned on the LED lantern and held it up high, and did the thing I always do at the beginning. I stopped and I looked, really looked, not the quick scan I'd done earlier. I looked at the ceiling, at the way the joists ran, at the point where the masonry walls met the concrete slab floor, at the irregular map of water stains on the concrete block. The room was roughly 40 feet by 25 feet, the ceiling height around 7 feet, the mechanical equipment occupying the center and south portions. A boiler that was enormous. A Cleaver Brooks commercial unit, probably a 1975 or 1980 model, maybe a 400 horsepower rating based on the size, with a ring of pipes coming off it in all directions, insulated in deteriorating fiberglass wrap that had started to shed in tufts across the floor. 2 large pressure tanks, the electrical panel on the east wall, a big panel with rows of breakers, most of them in the off position. I walked to the electrical panel first, and looked at the breaker labels. Standard stuff. HVAC zones, kitchen, guest rooms, lodge lighting, exterior lighting. But there were 4 breakers at the bottom of the panel that were labeled with numbers rather than descriptive names. 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, all 4 in the off position. The labeling was done with a label maker, the kind of adhesive tape label, but it was a different label tape than everything else on the panel. Different font, different color, slightly different vintage. Someone had added those 4 breakers later. I noted that and kept moving. The northeast corner of the basement was where the slab crack was that I'd noticed earlier, the one with the curve to it that didn't look like normal settling. I went there now with the lantern held close to the floor, and I crouched down and looked at the crack carefully. It ran roughly 18 inches, curving from south to north, and the concrete on one side of it was very slightly higher than the other, less than a 1/4 inch of differential, but visible if you knew what to look for. That kind of edge displacement, that kind of curved crack pattern, it told me there was something underneath the slab that had moved, not settling, not heaving from frost, something with a rectangular footprint, from the curve of the crack, something that had slightly shifted. I got lower, almost lying on the concrete, and I looked at the far corner of the room. The lantern was throwing shadows everywhere, and in the shadows the corner looked normal, but the floor. I put my hand on the concrete in the far northeast corner, and the concrete was different. I know concrete. I've poured it, tested it, assessed it for 20 years. This patch in the corner was poured at a different time than the surrounding floor. The aggregate was different, finer, more uniform, with none of the local river gravel that made up the coarser mix in the rest of the floor. And the color was subtly different, a shade grayer, more uniform, the color of concrete poured with a more controlled mix. I stood up and I looked at the walls, the north wall at this corner, the corner against the outside of the building, where the building foundation met the mountain, was concrete block, same as the rest. But if you looked at the wall carefully, if you stood at the right angle and held the lantern just so, the block pattern in the northeastern corner was different. The rest of the room had concrete block laid in a running bond pattern, every course offset by half a block from the course above it. But in the northeastern corner, there was a section roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, where the blocks were laid in a stack bond pattern instead. Every block directly above the one below it, no offset. You would never lay block that way for a structural wall. Stack bond is weak. The only reason to use stack bond for a section of wall is if you need that section to be disassembled and reassembled, if you need it to be a door. I pressed on the block. Solid. Didn't move. I looked at the mortar joints. In the surrounding wall, the mortar was stained and aged, darker gray, slightly crumbled at the surface in spots. In the stack bond section, the mortar joints were cleaner. Not as clean as new mortar. Someone had done something to age it, maybe rubbed in concrete dust. But if you pressed your fingernail into a joint in the stack bond section versus a joint in the main wall, the stack bond section's mortar was harder. The main wall's mortar had the slight give of mortar that has carbonated and aged over 50 years. The stack bond section's mortar didn't. I spent probably 20 minutes just moving around that corner, measuring with my laser distance measurer, tapping, looking, reasoning through what I was seeing. The conclusion I reached was this. There was a door in this wall. It was disguised as a concrete block wall section, but it was a door, a heavy one, mounted on hidden hinges, with a faux mortar facade applied over what was actually a single poured concrete panel. The curved slab crack suggested that when this door had last been moved, the movement had been significant enough to cause a slight settlement differential in the concrete floor, which meant the door was heavy, very heavy. And the 4 mystery breakers on the electrical panel that didn't match the rest of the building's labeling system, those weren't added by the resort. They were added by whoever built whatever was on the other side of this wall. I looked for a mechanism. There had to be a way to open it. The faux mortar facade meant the opening mechanism wasn't going to be obvious. No handle, no visible hinge, nothing you could grab. I went over the surface of the stack bond section systematically, every block face, pressing and probing. Then I went around the corner to the section of north wall that was adjacent, to the east of the stack bond section, outside what I was now certain was the door's footprint. And there, at exactly 48 inches from the floor, I found a single block that was slightly recessed compared to its neighbors. Less than a quarter inch, but enough to feel under my fingers. The kind of thing you'd never notice if you weren't specifically looking. I pushed on it. Nothing. I pushed and twisted clockwise. Nothing. I twisted counterclockwise, and the block moved. Just barely. A subtle rotation of maybe 15 degrees. And from inside the wall, I heard something mechanical engage. A deep click that traveled through the block into my palm. The stack bond section didn't swing open. Nothing that dramatic. What happened was that, from somewhere in the ceiling, from a spot I'd have to find with the lantern, there was a mechanical release sound, and when I went back to the stack bond section and pressed on the upper right corner of it, the whole panel moved. Not a swing, more of a pivot on some concealed vertical axis at its center. It moved slowly, grinding slightly. The grinding sound of something that hasn't moved in a while. Grit in the mechanism maybe, or the hinges needing oil. But it moved. Half of it swung toward me, and the other half swung away. Behind it was a short concrete corridor, maybe 10 feet long, and at the end of the corridor, a door. Not a disguised door this time, a real door. Heavy steel, commercial grade, with a full perimeter seal along its frame. Industrial. The kind of door I'd seen on communications vaults and equipment rooms in federal buildings. It had a lever handle and a keyed deadbolt, and the deadbolt was not engaged. The lock cylinder was in the unlocked position, which meant someone had left it unlocked, or hadn't had time to lock it on the way out. I stood in that concrete corridor and listened. From above me, from the lodge floor overhead, I could hear the sounds of whatever was in the parking lot. Faint, filtered through concrete and earth. But there, low sounds, movement. From ahead of me, through the steel door, there was nothing. Complete silence. Not the alive silence of an occupied space, the flat, dead silence of a sealed environment. I put my hand on the lever handle. Here's something I've noticed about myself over the years. Working in structures other people think are too dangerous to enter. I don't hesitate at the threshold. Other engineers, other inspectors, they stand outside a compromised building, and they assess from the exterior, and they think about what might happen if they go in. I do that too, but then I go in. I've always gone in. My ex-wife said it was a flaw, that I was bad at stopping myself from entering situations simply because the situation was interesting. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't wrong about most things. I pulled the lever. The door opened. The air that came out of it was different. It was cool. Not cold like the rest of the basement, but temperature-controlled cool. And it was dry, noticeably drier than the damp concrete air of the boiler room. And it smelled like, this is going to sound strange, it smelled like an office, like a closed office. Paper and electronics and the faint chemical smell of industrial cleaning products that had been applied a long time ago and had since faded to a ghost of themselves. I held the lantern up and stepped inside. The corridor continued for another 20 feet before opening into a room. I walked slowly, looking at everything. The corridor walls were painted concrete, a light gray, smooth, with conduit running along the ceiling carrying heavy-gauge wiring. The floor was poured concrete, but sealed this time, a penetrating sealer that had kept the surface clean. The light fixtures overhead were fluorescent tube units. Those heavy industrial fixtures with the cage guards around them that you see in industrial and military installations. They were off. The conduit from the electrical panel in the boiler room, I could see where it terminated in a junction box on the wall here, and from there, distributed to the fixtures and further down the corridor. The 4 mystery breakers. If I went back up and flipped them. But first I needed to see what was here. The main room was maybe 30 feet by 40 feet. And it stopped my breathing for a moment when the lantern swung through it. It was, the only word I had was operational. It looked like a place that people had been using, yesterday or the day before or last week. Not like the upstairs lodge, which felt like something that had been closed and left and abandoned. This room had the energy of a space that had been recently vacated. Chairs pushed back from workstations at irregular angles. Coffee mugs on the desks, 3 of them. And when I looked close, 2 had coffee residue still in them, dried to a dark brown stain on the ceramic. Papers on the tables, a jacket hanging from the back of one of the chairs. Maps, actual printed maps, pinned to a corkboard on the south wall, covered in handwritten annotations. A whiteboard on the east wall with writing on it, a mix of abbreviations, and what might have been a timeline. There were 6 workstations arranged in 2 rows. Each one had a flat-screen monitor, thin, relatively modern, not the old CRT types, and a keyboard and a heavy-duty desktop tower unit beneath. Most of the towers had small LED indicators on them that were dark and off, but one of them, in the back left corner, had a steady amber light showing. That unit was running. At least one computer in this room was running, which meant it had power, which meant there was power down here that wasn't connected to the resort's main electrical system. I moved deeper into the room, past the workstations, and found 2 other rooms accessed through interior doorways. The first was a dormitory, 4 bunk beds bolted to the walls, 8 bunks total. The beds were made with military precision on some of them, and on others, the blankets were thrown back, one of them on the floor, personal items on some of the shelf units beside the bunks. A book splayed open face down on the lower bunk of the farthest unit. I looked at it. A spy novel. A mass-market paperback. The kind of thing you read to pass time in a boring deployment. A pair of boots on the floor beside one bunk. Laces still partially tied. A framed photograph on one shelf, face down. I picked it up, turned it over. A family photo. A woman and 2 kids, in what looked like a park somewhere. Summer. Everyone squinting in the sun. On the back, handwriting. Portland, July 4th. Katie, Ben. No name for whoever had left this. The second interior room was what I could only call a mechanical room of a very different kind from the resort's boiler room upstairs. Here, the mechanical equipment was current. A diesel generator, a beefy one, a Caterpillar model with its own exhaust system that ran up through the ceiling in heavy black pipe. Fuel storage, 3 large drums and a secondary containment berm along the wall, the kind of red-painted drums with bungs on top. I checked one, full, or nearly, and beside the generator, a bank of sealed lead-acid batteries, 12 of them in a rack, connected in series parallel to provide a battery backup for the facility. The amber light on the computer tower was running off those batteries. Medical supply closet off the generator room, full, not stocked for a first aid station, stocked for a medical bay. IV supplies, surgical tools in sealed packages, antibiotics in sealed bottles, trauma kits, blood pressure cuffs, diagnostic equipment. More of everything than I could quickly catalog. Military medical grade, storage room adjacent to the main workspace, food storage, military rations, MRE boxes, dozens of them, stacked on metal shelving to the ceiling. And beyond the MREs, civilian canned goods in bulk, the commercial-size cans, cases and cases of them, dried goods in sealed 5-gallon plastic buckets, 20-liter water containers, a wall of them, enough food in this room to keep 6 to 8 people fed for. I started doing math and stopped because the number was too large to process in that moment. I went back to the main workspace and I sat down in one of the chairs in front of one of the workstations, not the one with the running computer. I wasn't ready for that, and I put my hands flat on the desk and I breathed. In and out, in and out. I looked at the coffee mug nearest me, the residue in it, the papers on the desk, a printed form with a letterhead that I couldn't fully read in the lantern light. I angled the lantern and caught part of it. The words I could make out were Joint Contingency Group, and beneath that, a series of numbers and letters that were a document classification. The word restricted was printed in a red stamp across the corner of the form. I set the lantern down on the desk, and I thought, slowly and carefully, about the chain of events that had led me to this moment. A building assessment job in the mountains, an outbreak of something in the town below, a hidden military installation under an abandoned ski resort, an installation that someone had left in a hurry, recently, if the dried coffee was any indication, and that was stocked for months of occupation. Above me, filtered through 2 floors of concrete and timber framing, I could hear the faint sounds of things moving through the parking lot, moving without intention, without purpose, responding to stimuli I hadn't provided. I said out loud to no one, To the empty chairs and the coffee-stained mugs and the family photo of Katie and Ben, I said, "Okay, this works." My voice sounded very strange in that sealed, dry air. The words came back at me with a flat reverb off the painted concrete walls. I cleared my throat. This actually works. Then I got up and I went back upstairs to do 3 things. I flipped the 4 mystery breakers on the main electrical panel. I went to every accessible window on the first floor and checked the positions of every infected person I could see in the lot and around the building, and I took an accurate count of my supplies. The breakers, when I flipped them on, sent a hum through the building. A low, resonant hum that I felt as much as heard, and when I went back down to the shelter and walked through the doorway, all the fluorescent fixtures were on. Bright, institutional, slightly buzzing. The room looked different in that light. Larger, more real, more deliberately designed. And in the overhead light, I could read the letterhead on the form on the desk. Properly this time. Joint Contingency Group, Pacific Northwest Tactical Element, Creston Peak Installation, CP7. And below that, in smaller type, Emergency Operational Protocols, Facility Continuance Document. There was a lot written on that form. I'd read it later. I needed to do the supply count and the window check first, because those things were immediate and the form could wait. Upstairs, through the windows, I counted 17 infected people visible in and around the parking lot and the approach to the building. My truck was in the middle of them, surrounded. I watched for a few minutes, confirming what I'd begun to understand about their behavior. They moved slowly. They reacted to sound. They didn't react to me watching from inside the dirty window, as long as I stayed still and quiet. 2 of them had walked around the side of the building toward the service entrance again, and lost interest when there were no sounds to follow. 1 of them had gone into the trees at the edge of the lot for no reason I could determine, and was moving through the trees in a vague, directionless pattern. What they were not doing, trying to get in. They had no concept of doors as things that could be opened. The main entrance doors were right there, and some of them passed within 10 feet of the doors, and not one of them tried the handle or tested the door or approached it with any interest whatsoever. They had no idea the doors were doors. To them, the building was just a large object among large objects in their world. I thought about that for a while. Then I went back downstairs. The shelter, the installation, the bunker, whatever you wanted to call it. I walked through it again with the overhead lights on, and I looked at everything with new eyes. In the fluorescent light, I could read things I couldn't in the lantern glow. The maps on the corkboard were topographic maps of the surrounding area. This mountain, the access road, the valley below, with colored pushpins and drawn lines indicating, what? Patrol routes? Observation points? The line annotations were in what looked like a military shorthand I couldn't read. The whiteboard had a partial timeline with dates going back about 8 months. Entries like Phase 2 init and Site Confirm and Protocol Shift. And then, at the top of the timeline, most recently, the entry that had a box drawn around it and was underlined, evac, Alpha Priority. Evac. They had left. They had evacuated this facility, and the question that immediately presented itself, standing there in the clean fluorescent light, with 17 zombies moving around the parking lot above me, was, why had they left a fully stocked, powered, secure underground facility? What was up here that was worse than being down here? I went through the desk drawers in the workspace. Most of them had been cleaned out. The top drawers that would have held personal items and everyday working materials were empty, or had only the most minor things. A pen, a paperclip, a folded sticky note with nothing written on it. The desk drawers that held operational files, the deeper bottom drawers, those were locked. Not all of them. 2 of the 6 workstations had bottom drawers that weren't locked, and they contained printed documents. I pulled them out and stacked them on the desk, and I started reading. What I found in those 2 unlocked drawers, I'm going to describe slowly, because I want to be accurate about what I understood and what I didn't. There were 12 documents total in the 2 drawers. 4 of them were administrative, supply manifests, maintenance logs for the generator and the battery system, a cleaning and waste management protocol. Useful, but not interesting. 3 were technical, diagrams and specifications for the facility's systems. The electrical diagram that showed me exactly what those 4 mystery breakers controlled. A structural diagram of the facility that showed me its full footprint. It was bigger than I'd explored so far. There was an east wing I hadn't found yet, access through a door in the dormitory that I'd passed without opening. And there was a lower level, a sub-level below this one, accessed by a staircase in the generator room behind where the battery rack was. 5 more documents. 3 of them were what I would call operational briefings. Dense text, lots of acronyms, written in a style that assumed the reader already knew the context. I could pull things out of them, but not get the full picture. I understood. This installation was one of at least 6 similar installations in the Pacific Northwest. I understood. It was operated by a joint group that wasn't exclusively military. There were references to civilian contractors, and, in one document, to a university partner that was redacted. I understood. The installation's primary purpose was listed as climate event monitoring, but that phrase appeared in quotation marks in one of the documents, written by hand in the margin as a quotation, with a handwritten note beside it that said, "Cover designation, actual purpose, see CP7 operational protocol, classified TS/SCI. TS/SCI. Top secret sensitive compartmented information. The highest classification level in the U.S. government system. Not just classified. Compartmented, meaning you needed a specific clearance for a specific program to even know this document existed. The 2 remaining documents I could read, the ones that weren't locked away, the ones that someone either hadn't thought to secure or hadn't had time to secure when they evacuated, I read 3 times. I'm going to tell you what they said, but not right now. Not tonight, because what they said sent me into a very long period of sitting very still in the chair in front of the turned-off monitor, staring at the classified letterhead, and not processing much beyond the basic fact that the world above me was worse than I had imagined, for reasons that were more complicated than anything I'd imagined, and that I was going to need to be very careful about what I did next. What I did do, in the immediate term, was the practical things. I went through the storage room and I took a full inventory. I found the water system. The installation had its own well tap, a borehole down to the aquifer, with an electric pump, and the water ran through a filtration and UV treatment system before coming out of the taps in the small bathroom at the back of the dormitory. I turned the tap and ran it for 30 seconds and tasted the water carefully. Clean, cold, more than fine. The water problem was solved indefinitely. The MREs, 64 cases, 12 MREs per case, 768 individual meals. Each MRE nominally provided about 1,200 calories, though the actual content varied. One person, consuming 3 per day, call it about 3,600 calories. Generous, maybe too generous for sedentary time, but right for active survival. Could last 69 days on the MREs alone. Add the civilian canned goods, the dried goods in the buckets, and you were looking at well over 4 months of food for one person. For a full team of 8, which this place seemed designed for, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. I was one person. I ate my first real meal in the shelter that evening. It was getting dark outside. I knew because I'd gone upstairs twice more to check the situation above, and the infected in the parking lot were still there, still moving, still doing their slow, purposeless circulation. I ate a beef stew MRE and a packet of crackers, and I drank 2 full mugs of water from the clean tap, and I sat in the bright fluorescent light of the operations room, and I read through the documents again. The 2 that mattered, and then I put them in a specific place, not back in the drawer, somewhere I'd chosen carefully, and I sat back, and I thought about what I needed to do. The shelter needed to be properly secured. The pivot panel door between the corridor and the basement boiler room was cleverly disguised, but it wasn't a lock. It was concealment, not security. Anyone who ended up in the boiler room and examined the northeast corner carefully would find it, the way I had found it. That needed to be addressed. The east wing I hadn't explored yet. I needed to know what was in there. The sub-level below this one. Same. The generator was not running. It was the battery bank keeping the facility lit. The generator had fuel and appeared to be in good mechanical shape, but running a diesel generator in an enclosed space created exhaust problems that the facility's ventilation system should handle, but I needed to understand the ventilation system before I ran the generator. I found the maintenance log and started reading it, slowly, going through 6 months of weekly entries. The ventilation was on its own filtered system, with an intake and exhaust that vented up through the mountain slope behind the resort, in 2 disguised caps that looked like natural rock formations. The system had been functioning correctly up until the last maintenance entry, 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, someone had been in this facility doing maintenance. This facility had not been sitting idle since the resort closed. It had been actively staffed, actively maintained, right up until whatever had made them leave in a hurry. The evac entry on the whiteboard. I went to look at it again, crouching close to read the date. 6 days ago. They had evacuated this facility 6 days before today. The fires in Granger Creek had started this morning. Whatever had caused this outbreak had been happening for at least 6 days. Long enough for the crew at this installation to know about it. Long enough for them to decide to leave, and they had left this facility when they went. They'd gone somewhere else, or they'd tried to, and I didn't know where or if they'd made it. I went to find the east wing. The door in the dormitory was behind a shelving unit, a big metal storage shelf that had been pushed against the wall, not locked in position, not bolted, just pushed. I moved it out from the wall about 18 inches and found the door behind it. This one was a regular interior door, hollow core, the kind of door you'd find in any office building. It opened without a lock, swinging on standard hinges into a short passage, and the passage led to, this is where my breath caught a second time that day, a communications room. The room was maybe 15 by 15 feet. One wall was entirely taken up by a rack-mounted communications array, radio equipment, most of it beyond my ability to identify by model, a mix of frequencies and systems that I recognized as including HF radio, VHF, UHF tactical, and satellite uplink capability. There was an antenna drive system in the rack that would control a surface antenna. Probably that antenna was somewhere above on the mountain slope, hidden, pointed at the sky. And most importantly, there was a satellite phone mounted in a charging cradle on the desk beside the radio array, a proper ruggedized sat phone, a military variant that I'd seen used on remote job sites. I picked it up. The screen lit up. It had a charge. The satellite phone didn't need cell towers. I stood in the communications room of a classified military installation in the Cascade Mountains, with a satellite phone in my hand, and I realized I was shaking. My hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, from the specific overload of the last 8 hours. I gripped the phone harder to stop it, and I thought about who to call. My ex-wife was in Spokane. My parents were in Portland. My sister was. I couldn't remember if she was still in Seattle or if she'd moved. There was a guy I worked with sometimes, Greg Holt, a mechanical engineer. He was a friend, in the way that people who only talk about work can be friends. I had a contact number for Morrow and Tate. I called 911 first. Not the regular cell network, satellite. It connected immediately, no busy signal, but it rang 17 times with no answer before it disconnected. I tried again, same. I tried FEMA's public line, a number I had memorized from a mandatory training course we'd all taken when I was still at the firm. What to do if you encounter a structure that poses public safety risks. Who to call. The chain of notification. It connected and gave me a recorded message instructing me to follow local emergency broadcasts and stay off the line unless I had specific information to report that could assist emergency operations. Leave a message. I left a message. I said I was Pete Calloway, structural engineer, and I was at Creston Peak Resort at the coordinates I read off the topographic map on the corkboard, and I had found a secured facility with significant resources, and I was sheltering in place. And if anyone was organizing rescue operations or supply coordination, I was available and I had access to communications and medical supplies, and could be a coordination point. I left the satellite phone number from the placard on the charging cradle. I said my name twice and the location twice, and then I hung up. Then I sat for a moment, and then I called my sister. Her name is Dana. She was in Seattle. I remembered then. She'd taken a job there about 18 months ago. The phone rang 5 times and she didn't answer. I tried again. On the 3rd try, the call didn't connect at all. Just a silence, and then a click, and the call ended. I tried my parents in Portland. No answer. Call failed after 3 rings. I tried Greg Holt's cell. Connected, rang 8 times, went to voicemail. I said, "Greg, it's Pete. If you hear this, I'm fine. I'm at Creston Peak in the Cascades. I have shelter and food. I don't know what's happening, but I'm safe. Call this number." And I gave him the satellite number again. I put the phone in my shirt pocket, against my chest, and I went back out through the dormitory into the operations room, and I sat in a chair in the bright light, and I ran my hands over my face a couple of times. My truck was in the parking lot, surrounded by 17, possibly more by now, of whatever those people had become. It had my full field kit in it, including things I might need. It also had my personal bag, my wallet, my car keys, and the paperwork for this job. None of that mattered right now. What mattered, I was in a sealed, powered, stocked underground facility. The infected above me could not find this facility unless they stumbled through the exact sequence of events that would expose the pivot door, which required knowing to look for the recessed block, which required understanding what a stack bond versus running bond masonry pattern indicated, which required being a structural engineer. They were not structural engineers. I was going to survive this, at least tonight, at least this week, and the question was everything after. I went and found the stairs to the sub-level. They were in the generator room, in the corner behind the battery rack, a pull ring in the floor, a trap door, steep stairs going down. I stood at the top and shone the lantern down. Another concrete room, smaller. The light from the operations room didn't reach down there, and I didn't know if the sub-level had its own lighting on the same circuit. I'd find out. I went down. The sub-level was one room, roughly 20 by 20 feet, with a ceiling height that felt lower than everything above, maybe 6 feet, maybe 6.5. Enough to stand without ducking, but not enough for comfort. The walls were concrete poured solid, not block, and thicker than above. The ceiling was a heavily reinforced slab with visible rebar ends at the edges. This room had been built to survive something specific, something that would stress the structure above it. Along the east wall, steel shelving holding more supplies, but different from the food and medical stores above. These were equipment cases, hard-sided, black, with combination locks, 14 of them, various sizes. Whatever was in them, whoever left this facility, they hadn't taken these cases. They hadn't taken them, but they'd locked them. Along the north wall, a communications repeater unit that I recognized from one of the technical documents I'd read upstairs. It was a radio relay that could boost the satellite phone's signal and extend the range of the tactical radios. And along the west wall, a server rack, 4 rack units, full height, with their power LED indicators all dark. But the cabling from these servers, heavy gauge Ethernet, running up through conduit to the operations level, connected to those workstations with the flat screen monitors upstairs. And in the middle of the server rack, a single hard drive unit with a sticky note attached to it, a small yellow square with a handwritten message. I held the lantern to it and read. The sticky note said, "If you're reading this and you're not us, you're either lucky or you're the problem. Either way, stay away from Unit 3. R." Below that, in different handwriting, different pen, different pressure on the paper. Don't listen to R. If you found this, you need to know. The drive in Unit 3 has everything. Don't let them bury it again. T. 2 different people, R and T. One of them saying stay away, one of them saying look. They had disagreed about this, about whatever was on that drive, and they had both left their notes on the same sticky note, one after the other, and they had both left. Without the drive, without resolving whatever disagreement existed between R and T. I looked at Unit 3 in the rack. It was third from the top. A standard rack-mounted server, nothing externally unusual. Its power LED was dark like the others. I turned around and looked at the equipment cases along the east wall. 14 locked cases. A sticky note with a disagreement about classified information. A facility that had been evacuated 6 days ago by people who knew something about what was happening in the world above. And on my last sweep through the generator room, I had noticed something I hadn't processed consciously until right now, standing in the sub-level with a lantern and the sticky note and 14 locked cases. on the generator room floor, against the wall near the fuel drums. Brownish, dried, a handprint, a partial handprint, the heel of a palm and 2 finger smears, like someone had pressed their hand to the floor or the wall in a hurry. And the color of it was wrong for grease or mud. It was the specific dark brownish color of dried blood. Whatever had happened when they left, it hadn't been entirely orderly. I went back upstairs. I needed to sleep. I needed to eat again and drink water and lie down and give my body and brain 8 hours to process what had happened today. Tomorrow I would start doing things properly. Tomorrow I would understand the ventilation system and run the generator and do a full inventory and figure out what else this facility was hiding. Tonight, I needed to eat and sleep and not think about R&T and what was on Unit 3. I heated an MRE. The facility had a small electric hot plate in the dormitory alcove, and I ate it sitting on the lower bunk that had no personal items on it. No belongings, obviously unoccupied. I stripped off my boots and my work jacket. I lay down on top of the wool blanket with my clothes on and my crowbar within arm's reach, and the LED lantern set on its lowest setting on the shelf beside me. Above me, through the concrete and the timber and the floors, I couldn't hear the parking lot anymore. The shelter was too well sealed. I was sealed in, and they were sealed out. And in the specific geometric logic of this structure, that was the only thing that mattered right now. I thought about the 2 documents. The ones that mattered. The ones I'd read 3 times in the operations room. I thought about the specific information in them. The carefully clinical language of government documents describing things that should not be written in clinical language. Then I turned off the lantern, and I lay in absolute dark, and I listened to my own breathing, and I went to sleep. I am going to tell you something about sleeping in the dark in an underground room on the first day of the end of the world. It was the best sleep I'd had in 6 months. My brain, stripped of everything that wasn't immediate, had no space left for the low-grade chronic anxiety that had been my normal nighttime companion for years. No thoughts about the next job, the next invoice, the money in my account, whether the transmission on the truck was going to go. All of that was gone. I slept like a stone. I woke up once, briefly, around what I guessed was 2 or 3 in the morning, by the blurriness of the hour. I lay in the dark and I thought I heard something. Not from above, not from the shelter's rooms around me. From below, from the sub-level under the trapdoor in the generator room, a sound that could have been structural, the building settling, thermal contraction in the night cold above, but that lasted too long and had a rhythm that thermal movement doesn't have. 3 sounds, spaced unevenly, then silence, then 2 sounds. I lay completely still and listened for another 10 minutes and heard nothing more, and then I went back to sleep. And I told myself in the morning I would check the sub-level again and find whatever was making that noise and address it practically and without panic, the way I addressed every problem in every building I'd ever inspected. I woke at what felt like early morning, though without a window, without the sky. Time was already starting to blur at the edges. I checked my watch. 6:47 a.m. Day 2, October 24th. I lay on the bunk for a moment, and I thought about everything I needed to do today, in order, by priority. Check the above-ground situation, understand the ventilation system, run the generator, explore the east wing fully, figure out the sub-level noise, eat, drink, begin building a real routine. What I actually did first, before any of that, was go to the communications room and check the satellite phone. There was a voicemail on it. One voicemail, received at 11:53 p.m. the night before. I played it. The voice on it was a man's. Low, careful, controlled. He said, "This is Lieutenant Colonel William Reese, Joint Contingency Group. Whoever has accessed CP7, you need to understand that facility is understanding restricted access protocols. Civilian access to this installation is a federal matter. Do not touch the communication equipment. Do not access the server room. Do not attempt to read classified documents. If you have already done any of these things, do not leave the facility. Repeat, do not leave. We are tracking this line, and we will be in contact within 48 hours. You are not in danger, as long as you remain where you are, and do not interfere with classified materials. He paused for a moment. Then he said, quieter, like he'd almost hung up but hadn't. The things outside, they can hear you. They can't think, they can't plan. But there are more of them than you've seen. A lot more. Don't make noise. Don't open external doors unless you absolutely have to. The shelter is the right place to be. Then the voicemail ended. I played it twice more. Then I put the phone back in the charging cradle, and I sat in the communications room chair, and I thought about William Reese for a few minutes. I thought about what the phrase, "We are tracking this line," meant. I thought about the phrase, "Do not interfere with classified materials," specifically in light of the sticky note from R&T arguing about Unit 3, and I thought about the phrase, "Within 48 hours," which meant either he was coming here or he expected to have contact through the satellite phone in 2 days. The 2 documents I'd read yesterday, the ones that mattered, I was going to have to tell you what was in them eventually, but not in this first account, not this morning, sitting in the communications room with a voicemail from someone who knew I was here and knew what this place contained and was telling me to stay put and not touch the classified materials. Because what was in those 2 documents made "stay put and don't interfere" sound like either the safest advice anyone had ever given me or the most dangerous. I hadn't decided which yet. I went to the small bathroom, washed my face and hands in the clean cold water from the aquifer tap, looked at myself in the mirror over the sink. My face looked like someone who had slept well, but had also spent the previous day experiencing what might have been the collapse of human civilization. And those 2 conditions sat on my face in a strange combination. I looked okay, grayer than usual around the eyes. My left cheekbone had a bruise on it that I couldn't account for. Maybe I'd hit something during the chaotic first hour upstairs. Maybe the low pipe junction in the basement when the scream had startled me. I thought about the 17 people in the parking lot. I thought about the woman in the waitress uniform. I thought about the 2 documents. Then I went and made coffee. The coffee pods from the restaurant upstairs were not going to last, but the storage room had vacuum-sealed bags of ground coffee and a French press on the shelf, and I made a proper mug, and I drank it standing in the operations room with the fluorescent lights humming and the classified maps pinned to the corkboard and the whiteboard timeline with its boxed and underlined evac. The day was beginning. Day 2, in a place that had already started to feel less like a discovery and more like an inherited problem. Outside, far above me, something moved through the empty parking lot and past the silent lodge. I couldn't hear it from down here. I couldn't hear any of them. They were up there, doing whatever they did in the dark and the early morning cold of October in the mountains, moving without purpose through a space that used to be filled with people. And I was down here, below them, in a place that had been built for a specific purpose that was not going to be as simple as it appeared. I went to the corkboard and I looked at the maps. I found the 6 pushpins on the topographic map of the Cascades, 6 positions scattered across the mountains, each one marked with a small flag of different colored tape. Each flag was labeled in the same shorthand, CP1 through CP7. I was at CP7. There were 6 other installations. I didn't know what was at those 6 positions. I didn't know if anyone was at those 6 positions. But I knew they existed, and I knew they were labeled on a map in this room, and I knew that William Reese had said, "We." When he left me that voicemail, I put my finger on CP7's pushpin on the map. Then I traced the lines between it and the others. Some were close. CP5 was maybe 30 miles south. CP3 was north, deeper into the mountains. The colored tape on each flag. CP7's flag, mine, was green. 3 of the others were green as well. 2 were yellow. And 1, CP2, the southernmost, had red tape on its flag. Just red. I thought about what those colors might mean in a military installation's coding system. In most standard systems I'd encountered in federal building work, green was operational, yellow was reduced capacity or standby, red was compromised or non-operational. CP2 was compromised or non-operational. I wrote that in my field notebook. Still had it. Still in my jacket pocket. And I added it to what I knew, and what I suspected, and what I had no idea about at all. Outside, the mountains were cold, and gray, and full of things that used to be people. I was in a box of concrete under a dead ski resort, alone, with 48 hours until someone named William Reese was either going to contact me or arrive here, and I had a sticky note telling me that whatever was on Unit 3 in the sub-level server rack was something someone wanted buried and someone else wanted exposed. The coffee was good. The light was steady. The food was enough. For the first time in a long time, and this is embarrassing to admit, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because any of this was good, because none of it was good, but because the building under me was solid, and I understood solid, and I was the kind of person who goes into the building and finds out what it's keeping. Day 2 started with a smell. Not a bad smell. That's what was strange about it. I was lying on the bunk in the dormitory with my watch, telling me it was 5:51 in the morning, and I was smelling something that took me a full 30 seconds to identify, because it had no business being here. Underground, in a sealed military installation under an abandoned ski resort in the Cascades. What I was smelling was pine. Fresh pine. The particular sharp resin smell of a cut branch. Not the stale version that old wood gives off after years of drying. I sat up on the bunk. Fresh pine meant the ventilation system was pulling outside air in, which meant the ventilation was working, which was good, but also meant it was pulling air from above ground level somewhere up the mountain slope, through a duct that was presumably terminating in those fake rock cap structures I'd read about in the maintenance manual. The air coming through the vent carried a faint trace of the outside, pine resin and cold mountain morning, and, underneath those, something else that I identified a moment later as wood smoke. Someone had a fire going somewhere on the mountain, or in the valley, or it was coming from the ongoing fires in Granger Creek, though after nearly 24 hours those would be fading unless something new was burning. I filed it away, got up, went to the bathroom, used the toilet. The facility had a composting waste system, not connected to any external sewer, self-contained, another thing I'd read about in the technical documents and been quietly relieved by, washed my hands, and went to make coffee. I had a routine now. 2 days in, and already a routine, which tells you something about how the engineer brain handles crisis. It defaults immediately to systems, to repeatable processes, to predictable sequences that create the feeling of control even in situations where control is largely an illusion. I made coffee. I drank it at the operations room desk while I wrote notes, and then I planned the day. Today I was going to start the generator. The ventilation system check had been the blocking task. I'd spent the previous afternoon, day 1's afternoon, after writing up the morning's discoveries and eating a second MRE, going through the ventilation manual and tracing the duct system physically through the facility. What I found was a well-designed system that had one problem. The vent cap on the secondary exhaust run, the one that handled generator exhaust, had a damper actuator that the maintenance log had flagged as sluggish 3 months ago and needs replacement 2 months ago, and was still unfixed as of the last entry 4 weeks back. A sluggish exhaust damper meant the damper might not open fully when the generator ran, which meant exhaust gases could back up into the facility. Carbon monoxide, odorless, lethal, not something you get a second chance to learn about. I'd spent 2 hours the previous evening tracing the exhaust duct from the generator to the surface. The duct ran up through the concrete wall in a heavy steel pipe, insulated, going up through the mountain slope to the surface. I couldn't access the damper from inside. It was at the surface end, up in the fake rock cap structure, probably 40 or 50 feet up the slope from the facility entrance in the basement. Getting to it meant going outside, but I'd found something else while tracing the duct. In the mechanical room, at the point where the exhaust pipe entered the wall, there was a bypass valve, an emergency bypass that could reroute generator exhaust out through the facility's primary air intake in an emergency, which seemed counterintuitive until I understood that the intake had its own damper, a motorized one, and the bypass system was designed so that if you opened the bypass but also reversed the intake damper to exhaust mode, the generator exhaust would go out through the intake duct instead. It was inelegant, and it meant the facility would be running without fresh air intake while the generator was running, which limited how long you could run it in a sealed environment. But for testing purposes, an hour, maybe 2, it was usable. I started the generator at 7:15 in the morning of day 2. The startup procedure was in the maintenance manual. There was a priming sequence, a glow plug warm-up period, a throttle protocol. I followed it exactly. The generator was a Cat C9, a 9-liter diesel, and when it caught and ran, it was loud in the enclosed generator room. Not earthquake loud, but significant. A steady diesel throb that vibrated through the concrete floor into my boots. Upstairs, through the resort floors, it would probably be inaudible. In the sublevel below, I imagined it was more pronounced. I ran it for 90 minutes the first time, long enough to put a charge back into the battery bank. The operation lights had drawn the batteries down to about 70% overnight, and long enough to test all the facility's electrical systems under real load. Everything worked. The fluorescent lights stayed steady. The water pump maintained pressure. The communications equipment in the east wing hummed to life. All of it, not just the satellite phone. The server rack in the sublevel, when I went down to check it, had all its power LEDs lit, including Unit 3. I stood in the sublevel looking at Unit 3's steady green power LED for about 30 seconds, and then I went back upstairs. Not yet. After the generator test, I went through the east wing properly. The communications room I'd found already, the radio array, the satellite phone, the antenna drive. But there was a second room in the east wing I hadn't fully explored. It was behind a door that had been locked with a key lock, and I'd put it on the to-do list and hadn't gotten back to it. In the daylight hours of day 2, I found the key, which was hanging on a small hook inside the desk drawer in the dormitory. The one logical place to hang a key, in an environment where everyone presumably had clearance, and the lock was just to control casual access. The key was a standard mortise key, labeled with a small tag that read E2. E2 turned out to be, depending on how you looked at it, either the most practical room in the facility or the most significant. It was an armory, not a large one, not a vault full of crates, a small room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a pegboard wall on the right side and a steel cabinet on the left, and a workbench in the center. On the pegboard, 2 M4 carbine rifles, hanging on pegs, with a tag showing they'd been cleaned and inspected 6 weeks prior. 3 Glock 17 handguns in a rack, same inspection tag vintage. Beside the rack, 6 loaded magazines for the M4s and 12 for the Glocks. On the workbench, a cleaning kit, boxes of ammunition in 2 calibers, and a pair of tactical flashlights, the kind with the rail mounts for firearms, real quality, surefire units. In the steel cabinet, 2 sets of tactical body armor, plate carriers with ceramic plates, sized medium and large, 2 helmets, 6 fragmentation grenades in a sealed box that I looked at for a long moment, and then did not touch, and on the bottom shelf of the cabinet, something that surprised me, a crossbow. Modern compound crossbow, cocked and ready with a bolt in the track, with a scope mounted on top and a quiver of bolts hanging beside it. The crossbow made me think. Crossbow is quiet. M4 is the opposite of quiet. Whoever had stocked this room had thought about the specific operational environment they expected to be working in, an environment where you might need to deal with threats but couldn't afford the sound of a gunshot. I took one of the Glocks and loaded it and put it in the back of my waistband. I took the crossbow and the quiver. I left the M4s. I'm not a complete stranger to firearms. I grew up in Eastern Oregon. I'd gone hunting with my father a handful of times through my teens, and the firm I'd worked for had sent us all through a mandatory safety course when we started working in some of the more remote sites. But I was realistic about my competency with an M4. Point and shoot was about the limit of what I knew. The Glock I felt reasonably sure about. The crossbow I felt cautious but interested in, and caution plus interest was usually enough for me to work with. I was taking the Glock through the operations room back toward the kitchen to make a second cup of coffee when I heard the sound from below. Not the sound I'd heard in the night, the 3 then 2 knock pattern. Something different, a continuous sound, low, from beneath the generator room floor. Rhythmic, steady. It took me a moment, and then I recognized it. It was someone tapping on a pipe. I went to the generator room immediately, moving fast but quiet. The generator was off now. I'd shut it down after the 90-minute test, so the room was silent except for the ticking of the cooling exhaust pipes. I stood on the floor and I listened. The tapping was still happening, continuous, like a slow heartbeat, about one tap every 4 seconds, coming from below the concrete floor, and specifically, I walked around the room placing my feet carefully, feeling for vibration, specifically from the southeast corner. I got the trapdoor and went down. In the sub-level, I stood still and listened. Closer now. Coming from, I moved toward the east wall. The east wall of the sub-level was solid concrete, no door, no visible feature, but the tapping was definitely on the other side of it. I knocked on the wall, 3 times, evenly spaced. The tapping stopped. Silence. 10 seconds. 20. I was about to knock again. Then from behind the wall, 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Same rhythm as mine. I'm going to be honest about what happened in my chest right then. It was not a simple feeling. It was a complicated mixture of relief, someone alive, someone here, and caution, someone who got here somehow, someone I don't know, and a specific fear that I couldn't name quickly, except to say it had something to do with the blood handprint I'd seen on the generator room floor, and the evac notation on the whiteboard, and the disagreement between R and T about what should be done with what was on Unit 3. I knocked 4 times, 211 to be specific about it, to see if whoever was on the other side understood that I was trying to communicate rather than just replicate the pattern. A pause. Then from the other side, 211, mirroring me exactly. I pressed my mouth close to the wall and said, quietly, barely above a whisper, "Is someone in there?" Silence. A long pause, maybe 15 seconds. Then a voice, muffled by concrete and distance. A woman's voice, rough with disuse or injury. "Yeah." Just that. Yeah. Not "I'm okay," not "help me," not "who are you." Just, "yeah." Which told me something about whoever was in there. Told me they had enough composure to be terse. Which meant they'd been in there long enough to get past panic and into something more durable. "Are you hurt?" I said, same near whisper. Another pause. Then, "Ankle. Not bad." "Is there a door?" "Locked from your side." Her voice was steadier now, getting used to being heard. "Emergency maintenance access. Should be marked on the floor plan somewhere." I went back upstairs immediately, not running, not making noise, but moving fast. And I got the facility diagram from the technical documents. I spread it on the operations room desk, and I found the sub-level schematic. There it was. A small secondary room on the east side of the sub-level, labeled Maintenance Crawl/Emergency Refuge, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, access through, I traced the line with my finger, access through a hatch in the floor of the east wall section, recessed, covered by the bottom shelf of the storage shelving along that wall. The shelving I'd been looking at from the other side. The shelving with the 14 locked equipment cases. I went back down. I moved the cases off the bottom shelf quickly. They were heavy, maybe 40 pounds each, and I had to stack them on the floor. And when I had the shelf clear, I could see the hatch. Steel plate, flush with the floor, with a recessed ring pull and a simple bar latch. I lifted the bar, pulled the ring. The hatch came up and cold, stale air came out of it, and then a face appeared at the bottom of the ladder, about 4 feet below the sub-level floor, looking up at me. A woman, maybe 35, with short dark hair and a bruise on her jaw, and a tactical jacket that matched the ones in the armory upstairs. She had been in this facility before. She had the jacket. She looked up at me for a second without saying anything. Then, "You're not Reese." "No," I said. "Who are you?" "Pete Calloway, structural engineer. I was doing a building assessment when the outbreak started. I found this place 2 days ago." She looked at me for another second, reading my face the way people do when they're trying to quickly decide whether to trust someone. Then she put her hands on the ladder rungs and climbed up, slowly. I could see that her left ankle was wrapped in something, a strip of fabric from the looks of it, improvised, and she kept her weight off it, climbing. When she came up through the hatch, I reached down and gave her my arm for the last step, and she took it without hesitation, which told me she was practical enough to accept help when it cost her nothing to accept it. She was about 5'8", lean, with the kind of precise economy of movement that comes from either military training or living for a long time in environments where being clumsy has real consequences. Her name, she told me once she'd sat down on the floor of the sublevel and stretched her bad ankle out in front of her, was Gail. Gail Tanner. She didn't tell me what her role had been in the Joint Contingency Group, and I didn't push it yet. What she told me was this. She had been in the facility. She called it the installation, not the shelter, with a team of 4 others when the decision to evacuate came down from Reese. The evacuation had been planned, she said, in the sense that Reese had been issuing preparatory orders for a week. But when the actual order came, something happened that accelerated it. Someone on the team, she said, one of the others, and didn't name who, had gotten careless coming back from an exterior monitoring run, and one of the infected had gotten close enough to make contact. Not a bite. Scratches. It wasn't clear at the time how transmission worked, whether scratches were a vector or only full bites. They'd left anyway, because the risk calculus of a potentially exposed team member in an enclosed facility was obvious enough that it didn't require a long discussion. They'd taken what they could carry. The equipment cases in the sublevel they couldn't carry. Too heavy, too many. Vehicles weren't close enough to the entry point. They'd meant to come back. What had happened to Gail was that during the evacuation, moving through the resort above, she'd twisted her ankle badly on a broken section of the east wing flooring. The condemned section, the avalanche damage, the floor she'd apparently not assessed as carefully as she should have. She'd gone through to her knee in a soft section. By the time the others pulled her clear, the infected in the parking lot had responded to the noise and were moving toward the building. Getting Gail to the vehicles was going to draw more attention than the team could manage. She'd made the decision herself. She'd go back to the installation, hole up in the emergency refuge where she could seal herself in and wait, and the team would come back when they could get clear and organized. That had been 6 days ago. 6 days in an 8x6 room with a 1-liter water bottle, 2 MREs, and a twisted ankle. I looked at her and thought about that for a second. I thought about what 6 days in a space that small felt like. And I thought about the fact that she looked like someone who had spent 6 days in a small space and was mildly inconvenienced by it, not broken, which either meant she was very tough or she was better at not showing things than anyone I'd ever met, possibly both. "Reese left you a voicemail," I said. "I know. I heard the phone ring in the communications room. I couldn't get out to answer it." She paused. "What did he say?" I told her. She listened with no expression until I got to the 48 hours part. And then she said, "He's not coming in 48 hours. "How do you know?" "Because he said 48 hours. She said it like it was obvious, and then seemed to realize it wasn't obvious to me. So she added, "When Reese gives you a firm timeline, something's wrong and he's managing you. When he's actually going to do something, he gives you a window. He'd say 48 to 72 hours, possible to confirm. He'd never give you a flat 48. I filed that, so he's not coming. He might send someone, or he might be trying to figure out if you're a threat first." She looked around the sub-level, at the server rack, at the equipment cases now on the floor. "You haven't opened the cases. They're locked. Not all of them." She pointed at the 4th case from the left on the floor, the one with a slightly different latch mechanism from the others. "That one takes a code. 4711. I said it myself." "What's in it?" "Things you'll want. Things I've been thinking about for 6 days that I should have taken with me when we left." She watched me for a second. "Open it and find out." I opened it. Inside the case, 2 portable radio units, the tactical kind, encrypted, with charging cables. A ruggedized laptop computer, the military variant, thick and matte black, with no visible branding. A stack of printed documents in a folder, this one labeled with a number sequence, rather than a title. A first aid kit more comprehensive than the one upstairs. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a hard drive unit, portable, the kind with a USB-C cable, labeled with a number, 3. The hard drive from Unit 3, in the server rack. She'd copied it. Or taken the drive itself, I wasn't sure which. The server rack still had a unit with its LED on, so maybe a copy. Either way, she had it. I looked at her. She was watching me look at the drive. R and T, I said, the sticky note. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise. She'd expected me to find the sticky note, but something more careful. Yeah, your T. Yeah. She said it without any particular drama about it, like she'd made peace with the fact days ago. R is Ryan Mack. He's with the program since the beginning. True believer. He thinks the information on that drive needs to be controlled until the government structure is back in place to handle it properly. She paused. I think by the time any government structure is back in place, it'll be too late for the information to matter. Too late how? She looked at the drive for a moment. Then she looked at me. How much did you read? In the documents upstairs. 2 of the operational briefings. More or less fully. I got the cover designation, climate monitoring, and the actual listed purpose, which was redacted in both documents. I got that this is one of 6 similar installations. I got the CP color coding on the map. I thought about what else. The reference to a university partner that was redacted. The timeline on the whiteboard going back 8 months. The evac notation 6 days ago. She nodded. And the 2 documents in the unlocked drawers? Those I read fully, 3 times. Then you know what this facility was actually monitoring. I have a strong working theory, I said. She waited. I said, the facility was monitoring a pathogen. Specifically, monitoring its spread through animal populations in the Cascades. That's what the field surveillance data in the first document was describing. Monthly reports of infected wildlife, starting 14 months ago with deer and smaller mammals, progressing to larger animals. Then in the last 4 months, something changed in the data. The infection vectors and behavioral changes documented in the latest reports weren't consistent with what they were seeing in the wildlife earlier. They were consistent with what I saw in the parking lot 2 days ago. Gail looked at me without blinking. The program knew this was coming, I said. This wasn't a surprise. Not to your group. Not to certain people in our group, she said. Some of us knew what the data meant for maybe 3 months before it reached humans. There were models. Good ones. She stopped, and in the pause I heard the generator room's cooling pipes ticking. The debate about those models. About what to do, who to tell, when to tell them. That debate is what I need you to understand before you decide what to do with that drive. I looked at the drive. What's on it exactly? Everything. The full 14-month data set. The predictive models. The internal communications about what to do with the information. The communications where certain people decided not to escalate it to public health channels. She said that last sentence quietly and without inflection, which made it hit harder than if she'd been angry about it. The names of who made those decisions and when. I put the drive back in the case. Have you eaten anything in 6 days? She blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting me to say, it wasn't that. MREs. I had 2. Come upstairs, I said. I'll make food. We'll talk about everything else after you've eaten. And I've done a full system check on this generator. She looked at me for a second with an expression I couldn't read. Then she said, okay. And she stood up, keeping her weight off the bad ankle, and followed me up through the trap door. We didn't immediately become whatever word you'd use for 2 people in an underground bunker who both have information the other needs and are both trying to decide how much to trust the other. We became something more transactional than that, at first. We were 2 people doing necessary things in a shared space. I heated 2 MREs while she went to the bathroom and cleaned up. I checked her ankle. Not a bad sprain. The fabric wrapping had kept it from swelling too much, and the first aid kit had an ACE bandage and a cold pack that helped. She sat at one of the workstations and ate while I finished the generator check and switched the bypass back to normal intake mode. Then we both sat in the operations room with coffee, and I asked her to tell me what I didn't know. What she told me over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to try to summarize accurately, because the details matter, and some of them took me a while to process. The Joint Contingency Group was not a standard military unit. It had military personnel in it, including Reese, but it was a joint operation between elements of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, 2 Pacific Northwest state environmental monitoring agencies, and a research group from a specific university. She named the university, which was a prominent one in the region, And I won't write the name here, because I'm not certain yet about the implications of writing it down. The program had started approximately 22 months ago as what it was publicly described as an environmental pathogen monitoring network, tracking naturally occurring prions and fungal pathogens in wildlife. Real work that real scientists had been doing. The cover wasn't invented. It was borrowed from legitimate existing research. What it became, starting about 14 months ago, was something else. The pathogen they began tracking in the wildlife around the Cascades wasn't a naturally occurring prion or fungus. It was something the monitoring equipment identified as anomalous because its transmission behavior didn't fit known models. It spread fast, faster than any documented wildlife disease. It produced consistent neurological changes in infected animals, and it had a specific quality that the researchers, particularly the ones from the university partner, had documented carefully, but hadn't, according to Gale, fully agreed on what it meant. It didn't kill its hosts quickly. It changed them. The infected animals remained functional, mobile, active for extended periods, weeks, in some observed cases, after the neurological changes had eliminated what you'd call normal executive function. Eliminate executive function. Keep the body running. Keep it moving toward stimuli. How did it reach humans? I asked. We don't know precisely. The models suggested it was inevitable once it reached certain mammal populations, because the transmission pathway was any direct fluid contact, blood, saliva. Anyone who hunted, who processed game, who was in extended contact with infected animals without knowing they were infected. She looked at her coffee mug. The first human cases were in Granger Creek, a hunting community, October 14th. October 14th was 9 days before I drove up the mountain for a building assessment. And nothing was said publicly, I said. Reese wanted to confirm the models first. The models said there was a 48-hour window from first confirmed human cases to exponential spread in a dense population. Confirmation protocols took longer than 48 hours. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, he waited to confirm, and by the time he confirmed, it was already everywhere. It was already in Granger Creek, Harlan, and Woodbridge County, which are not everywhere. It might have been contained if... She stopped. There's an argument for the other side, a credible argument. Unconfirmed alerts create panic. Panic creates movement. Movement spreads a contact pathogen faster than any other transmission vector. Reese could reasonably argue that a false alarm at day 1 does more damage than a confirmed alert at day 3. I don't agree with that argument, but I can hold it as reasonable. What can't you hold as reasonable? She looked at me steadily. The decision to not fully activate public health emergency protocols even after confirmation. The internal communications on that drive, from approximately October 18th to October 21st, 3 to 6 days after confirmed human cases, and 2 to 3 days after the models were showing county-level saturation. Those communications are between Reese and 2 other named individuals at a federal agency level, and what they're deciding in those communications is not how to alert the public. It's how to manage the information going forward, how to control what's documented, what to preserve and what to let burn. I heard the word burn and I thought about the black smoke columns I'd seen rising from Granger Creek at 10:30 in the morning 2 days ago. What Gale had seen fit to copy onto the portable drive and put in the equipment case where she could reach it, what she disagreed so fundamentally with Ryan Mack about, that they'd written opposing messages on the same sticky note and apparently hadn't resolved the disagreement before the evacuation, was evidence. Evidence of decisions made by specific people in positions of federal responsibility that had allowed a containable outbreak to become an uncontained one. Evidence of those people then choosing to manage information about those decisions rather than correct them. If society comes back, Gale said, not dramatically but flatly, the way you'd state a measurable structural fact, there need to be records of what happened. Not the version those communications propose to maintain, the real version. And if it doesn't come back? I asked. She thought about that for a moment. Then it doesn't matter. But it doesn't matter in the sense that we're probably dead, so the question is kind of moot. I respected the logic of that. I told her so. She almost smiled. It was a very small, almost smile. After that conversation, We fell into the first version of what would become our routine. I want to describe the daily life of those first several days in the shelter, because the mundane parts are as important as the dramatic ones. Maybe more so, because the mundane parts are what kept us sane enough to handle the dramatic ones when they came. We split responsibilities, the way two practical people split them when they've just met, and are trying to establish functional coexistence without a lot of discussion. Gail knew the facility's systems better than I did. She'd been staffing it for 3 months prior to the outbreak, so she took primary responsibility for communications monitoring, the radio array, the satellite phone, the monitoring protocols for the 6 other CP installations. I took the physical facility, maintenance, inventory, structural checks, any above-ground assessment. She was the systems person. I was the building person. Neither of us was the other's superior. We didn't discuss this. We just did it. And it worked. The first thing she told me when she took her seat at the communications workstation and put on the headset, "There's traffic on the tactical frequency that doesn't belong to us." How do you know it doesn't belong to you? Because I know our encryption keys, and this traffic isn't using them. It's on the same frequency range but unencrypted, which means either it's a civilian group that got hold of tactical hardware, or it's military outside our operational loop. She listened for a moment, head tilted. It's organized. Somebody with some training. The transmission pattern is disciplined. What are they saying? Coordinates, she said. And she adjusted something on the array. They're referencing CP designations. I looked at the map on the corkboard. 6 colored pushpins. They know about the CP installations, I said. They knew before this, she said. Someone told them. That sat in the room between us for a moment. I went to plan the supply run. The reality of our supply situation was better than it had been, but had a specific problem that needed to be solved. We had food, plenty. We had water, solved. We had medical supplies, weapons, communications equipment, power, shelter. What we were low on was diesel fuel. The generator drew roughly 1 gallon per hour at full load, about half that at reduced load. The 3 fuel drums in the generator room had started at full. I'd checked them, but the facility had been using them during the months it was staffed, and the last maintenance entry had noted that drum 1 was down to about 1/4 full, and drum 2 was at 60%. Drum 3 was full and sealed, never opened. So I had roughly 6 gallons in drum 1, 25 gallons in drum 2, 52 gallons in drum 3, 83 gallons total. At 1/2 gallon per hour running the generator 4 hours a day for battery maintenance, that was conservative. Might be tighter than that. 83 gallons gave me about 41 days of generator operation at that rate. 41 days was not forever. On a working ski resort, there would have been diesel storage for the snowcats, those big tracked vehicles that groomed the runs. The snowcat fuel storage would be in the maintenance garage, which was separate from the main lodge, maybe 150 feet north of the building across a service road. I'd assessed it from the outside during my initial walkthrough. A large metal building, roll-up doors, probably 800 to 1,000 square feet of floor space. I hadn't gone in. I hadn't needed to at the time. I needed to go in now. Planning the supply run took most of day 3. I went to the windows of the lodge twice during the day to do count and position checks on the infected in and around the property. My count had changed. The 17 I'd counted on day 1 had shifted. Some had drifted, probably following sounds or stimuli from outside the property. By day 3, my best count from the ground floor windows was 9 in the main parking lot, 2 on the north side of the building near the service entrance, and 3 that I could see partially at the edge of the tree line to the east. 14 visible, possibly more in areas I couldn't observe from the windows. But here was what I'd also noticed over 3 days of observation. The infected were not randomly distributed. They seemed to drift toward the south, toward the direction of the valley, toward Granger Creek. Over the course of a full day, the net movement was southward. Not intentional, not directed. They weren't navigating, they weren't marching. But statistically, over time, they drifted south, which meant the north side of the property, the side with the maintenance garage, tended to have fewer of them. In the morning of day 3, from the northern kitchen window, I counted 2 infected in the service road area between the lodge and the maintenance garage. By afternoon, one of them had drifted east toward the trees. By late afternoon, there was only one visible on the north side, standing near the edge of the service road, not moving much, doing the swaying, almost in place thing that seemed to be their resting state. The maintenance garage was 150 feet from the service entrance of the lodge. One infected between me and the garage. I planned the route, the timing, and the abort protocol. Route, service entrance, along the back wall of the lodge to the northwest corner, then across the service road to the garage's personnel door on the west side. If the personnel door was locked, the main roll-up door might be openable from the outside with the emergency release cord. Timing. Just after first light, when the temperature was coldest and the infected seemed to be at their least active. I'd noticed over 3 days that they moved less in the cold hours of early morning, though I wasn't sure if that was temperature affecting their physiology or just the fact that there were fewer ambient sounds in early morning to attract them. Abort protocol. If more than 3 infected were visible on the north side when I was ready to go, I waited. If I got to the halfway point and encountered unexpected contacts, I went back to the lodge rather than forward to the garage. I told Gail the plan. She looked at it and nodded. The crossbow's a better call than the Glock if you need to handle one at close range, but you'll have 1 shot and then you're reloading, which is slow. She thought for a moment. There's a fire axe in the maintenance room. Wall mount, next to the extinguisher. That's loud. Only if you miss. I didn't have an immediate response to that. I went on the morning of day 4, October 27th. I got up at 5 a.m. and ate a cold MRE, and drank water, and checked the north side window and counted. 1 infected visible, the same one from yesterday, still near the service road but now positioned closer to the east, maybe 30 feet from where it had been. The drift was continuing. The service road between the lodge and the garage was clear. I unlocked the service entrance door. The lock disengaging sounded enormous in the silence, even though when I put my ear to the door, I could hear nothing from outside. Cold air came under the door. I gave it a full 2 minutes of standing still and listening before I opened it. The door opened outward, slow, controlled, no squeal. I'd oiled the hinges the previous afternoon specifically for this. Cold hit me. 40 degrees, maybe 38, with enough wind to cut through my jacket. October in the Cascades. The sky was gray-white with clouds that looked like they meant snow eventually. I stepped out onto the concrete step outside the service entrance and stood there in the doorway for 30 seconds, looking and listening, breathing through my nose, because a person breathing steam through their mouth in cold air is visible at distance. The infected I'd seen by the service road from the window, I couldn't see it from here. The building's corner blocked my sightline to where it had been, which meant I had to move before I knew where it was. I went along the back wall of the lodge, low, moving quietly, staying close to the wall where my footsteps were on concrete, rather than the gravel service road surface. The fire axe was on my belt, loop-mounted, the head down. The crossbow was across my back on the sling. I had the Glock in the waistband but wasn't touching it. Around the northwest corner of the lodge, the service road opened out ahead of me. The maintenance garage was across it, maybe 140 feet, and the infected, I found it, standing at the edge of the road, about 60 feet to my right and slightly behind me, in the position I'd last tracked it to from the window. Its back was mostly to me. It was doing the sway motion, slow, the head occasionally rolling slightly on the neck, not reacting to me, no sounds yet. I crossed the road quickly, not running. Running on gravel makes noise, but moving fast, staying on the concrete section of the service road surface, where it was smoothest. Crossed in about 12 seconds, reached the west wall of the maintenance garage, pressed against it and looked back. The infected near the road hadn't moved. The parking lot beyond the lodge's north side was empty as far as I could see. The personnel door was a standard commercial exterior door, locked. I'd brought a pry bar from the facility's tool storage, the short kind, and I used it on the door frame at the lock strike plate. It took about 20 seconds and some creaking that made my stomach clench before the plate gave and the door swung open. I went in and pulled it closed behind me. The maintenance garage smelled like old oil and diesel and rubber. A good smell, a working things smell, a smell I associated with every industrial site I'd ever worked on. Light came through the translucent roof panels, enough to see by. The interior was one large bay with a concrete floor stained dark with years of fluid leaks. 3 snowcats in various states of assembly along the north wall. Big tracked machines, 2 of them appearing functional, and 1 cannibalized for parts. Tool chests along the south wall, shelving along the east wall, and along the west wall, where I'd hoped they'd be, 4 large diesel storage tanks, fixed to the wall on metal brackets, with fuel lines running to a transfer pump. Commercial tanks, each one probably 200 gallons capacity. I went to the first one and found the level indicator, a sight glass on the side, and I looked at it. Half full, roughly 100 gallons. I went to the second, full. Third, about a quarter. Fourth, full. 475 gallons roughly. On top of what was in the facility's drums, I had over 500 gallons of diesel. At my conservative usage rate, that was over 8 months of generator operation. I stood in the cold maintenance garage and allowed myself a moment of something close to relief, because 8 months was a long time, and a long time was what I needed. Then I started methodically going through the shelving along the east wall. I was not just here for fuel assessment. I was here for everything useful. The shelving had boxes of spare parts for the snowcat engines, mostly useless to me. Heavy-duty work gloves, new in packaging. I took 2 pairs. A case of 2-stroke oil, useful potentially. Safety gear, ear protection, eye protection, masks. A large first aid kit, sealed. 3 cans of WD-40. And on the bottom shelf, something that surprised me. A sealed plastic tub labeled emergency rations, resort staff, containing what turned out to be about 40 energy bars and 12 packets of instant oatmeal, and 8 packets of instant coffee, and a flat of water bottles. Someone, at some point during the resort's operation, had been required to maintain emergency rations in remote work locations. The rations had an expiration date of 2 years from now. I loaded everything useful into the duffel bag I'd brought from the facility, and I checked the time. I'd been outside for 11 minutes. I'd planned for 15. I had 4 minutes. I went to the tool chests and opened them quickly. Standard mechanics tools, not particularly interesting to me except for one thing. A portable fuel transfer pump, the hand crank kind, with a hose and a nozzle. That would let me move fuel from the garage tanks to the facility's drums without needing external power. I added it to the bag. On my way back through the garage toward the personnel door, I passed the snowcats, and I slowed down briefly. The 2 functional-looking ones. I'm an engineer. I read structures and systems the way other people read faces. I looked at those 2 snowcats for about 30 seconds each, and what I assessed was tracked vehicles, capable of moving through deep snow, fully enclosed cab, probably a 10 to 15 mile per hour top speed on terrain, very hard to stop with small arms fire because of the tracks and the cab construction. Not fast, not invisible. They were loud, diesel-powered, would draw every infected in a mile radius if running. But as a last resort escape vehicle, if the access road became impassable by wheeled vehicle, and the situation at the facility became untenable, a snowcat could go places a truck couldn't. I filed that in the back of my mind under contingency planning. Outside, the infected near the service road had moved during my time in the garage. It was now about 20 feet further east, its back still toward the lodge. I went back across the service road, along the wall, and through the service entrance in about the same 12 seconds I'd taken on the way out, and I closed the door and relocked it with the interior latch, and stood in the kitchen corridor, breathing slightly harder than normal. Not from exertion, from the specific tension of having been outside and made it back. That particular relief has a physical component that I hadn't anticipated, a kind of whole-body release, like a fist unclenching everywhere at once. I brought the bag to the operations room, and Gail looked at the transfer pump and nodded. "Good call," she said. Then she looked at me with an expression that was doing several things at once. "While you were out, the radio traffic changed." "Changed how?" "They mentioned this location by name, not CP7, Creston Peak Resort, by name." I put the bag down on the desk. "They have someone who knows the area," she said. knows the physical location, not just the CP designation. Either they have access to the CP documentation, or they have someone who was previously associated with the program. Or both. Or both, she agreed. I sat down at the adjacent workstation. How many of them are there? Hard to say. I've picked up at least 4 distinct voices on the frequency over the last 3 hours. Possibly more. She pulled off the headset and set it on the desk. They're organized. They have vehicles. They referenced routes and fueling stops. And they're armed, or at least some of them are. One transmission was requesting a weapons inventory update. She looked at the corkboard map. Based on the coordinates I've been logging, they're moving north from the Granger Creek area. Best estimate puts them 2 days out, maybe 3 depending on the road conditions. 2 to 3 days. I thought about the pivot panel door in the basement, about how an engineer who was looking for it would find it, but how a group moving through the lodge in a hurry, not knowing what to look for, would walk right past it. About the fact that the stack bond masonry pattern in that corner was disguised well enough that even I had needed to look carefully. Then I thought about what Gail had said. They might have someone from the program. Someone who knew not just that this installation existed, but how to find it. Ryan Mack, I said. Gail was quiet for a moment. Maybe. He disagreed with you about the drive. Strongly enough to leave a note. Strongly enough that the 2 of you couldn't resolve it before the evacuation. If he's out there, and this group is looking for the installation. I know, she said. It was the same flat tone she used for things she'd already thought through, and arrived at a conclusion about, that she didn't like. I know. I picked up my notebook and I started drawing a map of the facility from memory, with all access points marked, and I started thinking about defense. Not offense. I wasn't planning to go looking for this group, but I was going to know exactly what I had and where my weak points were before they arrived at my door, because that's what you do with any load-bearing problem. You assess the structure before the load arrives. The days following that conversation, days 5, 6, and 7, I'm going to describe quickly, because they were full of work rather than incident. And the work matters for what came later, but is more useful summarized than narrated in detail. I completed a full systems audit of the facility, including the things I hadn't done yet. The ventilation system. I found the sluggish damper issue was addressable without going to the surface. There was an override switch in the mechanical room that forced the damper fully open electrically, bypassing the failing actuator. It drew a small constant power load, but it meant I could run the generator safely on normal exhaust routing. I noted in the maintenance log that the actuator needed physical replacement, but marked the override as acceptable short-term solution. The East Wing communications array. I worked with Gail to understand all the systems. The HF radio was the most interesting and most powerful tool we had. It could reach, theoretically, anywhere in the world, though the effectiveness depended on ionospheric conditions and required some skill to operate. Gail had the skill. Over 3 days, she raised 2 contacts on HF, a ham radio operator in Oregon, who was relaying emergency information and providing a picture of what was happening in the Willamette Valley. Bad, spreading, no coordinated government response visible, and a contact she wouldn't tell me much about except to say he was someone she trusted and that she was routing information to him. Information including, I gathered, what was on the drive. The sub-level, I did the full inventory of the 14 equipment cases. 12 of them were locked with combination locks I didn't have codes for. The 2 I could open contained, respectively, a set of drone components. A military-grade surveillance drone and flat-packed components with batteries and a controller, and a set of what I could only describe as monitoring equipment, scientific instruments for environmental sampling, which fit with the program's legitimate research cover. The drone was the more immediately useful of the 2. The weird thing happened on day 5, and I want to describe it carefully because I've gone back to it in my head many times, and I'm still not certain what I actually saw. I was on the 2nd floor of the lodge, doing a window check from the east-facing hallway windows, which gave me the best view of the tree line to the east and the slope going up toward the ski runs above. My count that morning was 7 infected, visible in and around the main property. I was watching them, tracking positions, when I noticed one of them doing something different from the others. It was standing at the edge of the parking lot, near the gate posts. It had been in the same position for about 20 minutes. The infected would sometimes go static like this, just standing, swaying very slightly, in what I'd come to think of as their idle state. What was different about this one was not its behavior in the moment I noticed it. What was different was what it did next. It turned, not in response to a sound, not in response to any stimulus I could identify. It turned and looked at the main lodge entrance, looked at it, held its gaze on it, for about 8 seconds. The others in the lot were not doing this. Then it turned away and resumed its directionless, slow movement. I watched it for another 10 minutes and it didn't repeat the behavior. It moved like all the others, responding to sounds, bumping into things without reacting to the collision, showing no sign of the specific directed attention I'd seen in those 8 seconds. I wrote it in my notebook. Day 5, 09:30 approximately. Subject near gate posts. Appears to visually attend to main entrance for approximately 8 seconds, without apparent auditory stimulus. Not repeated. Cannot rule out coincidental head orientation. Note for monitoring. I told Gail that evening. She listened carefully, and then said, "Document it, but don't draw conclusions yet." "I wasn't going to," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it as much for myself as for you." She looked at her coffee. The university research team, the ones who were running the neurological analysis of the infected wildlife. One of their last reports before the evacuation flagged something in the progression data, a subset of infected subjects showing delayed deterioration of higher cortical function. Most subjects showed complete executive function loss very quickly. Days, a week at most. A small subset was showing a slower pattern. Still deteriorating, but slower. The behaviors that persisted longer were mostly involuntary, reflexes, basic orientation responses. But the researchers were asking whether certain, they used the word remnants, whether certain remnants of trained or habitual behavior might persist longer than true executive function. I thought about a waitress, about a woman who had spent years walking toward the entrance of buildings when she got to work in the morning. Habitual behavior, I said. It's a hypothesis. In the data they had, it was preliminary. I don't know how far they got with it. She paused. It might be nothing. The behavior you observed might be coincidence. Might be, I said. We didn't talk about it again that night, but I increased my window monitoring to 6 times daily instead of 4, and I started logging every infected individual on the property with a position tag, tracking movement patterns over time, building a map of behaviors the way I'd build a structural load diagram. Data is data. You collect it until it tells you something. On day 7, the satellite phone rang. Not the voicemail ringer, the direct call. I was in the communications room when it went off, and I answered it on the second ring. The voice was Reese. "You're still there," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "Good. That's good." A pause. Static. He was on a satellite link from somewhere, and the connection was clear enough to hear that his voice was carrying something it hadn't carried in the voicemail. Tiredness. He sounded like a man who hadn't slept well in a week. "You found the facility?" "Yes." "Who else is there?" I thought about that for exactly 1 second and decided to be honest. "Gail Tanner." A longer pause. "She's alive." "Yes." "Is she hurt?" "Ankle injury. Recovering." "She's operational." Something in the static that might have been relief, or might have been a sound of the connection adjusting. "She told you about the program." "She told me some things. The documents told me others." "The documents in the unlocked drawers," he said. "Those were left unlocked by accident. During the evacuation, things moved faster than they should have." "I gathered," I said. "There was a blood handprint on the floor in the generator room. That was one of my team. He's fine. The evacuation was complicated." Another pause. "Calloway. That's your name from the message you left." "Calloway. What do you do?" "Structural engineer." "Christ," Reese said, not with exasperation, more with a kind of weary irony. "A structural engineer finds the only intact CP installation in the region." He said something under his breath that I didn't catch. Then, "Listen, the situation outside is bad, and it's not stabilizing. I have 2 functioning team members with me, and 1 vehicle, and we are not in a position to reach your location in the near term. Maybe not for weeks. We have our own problems. I know, I said. There's a group looking for the installation. They've been on the tactical frequency. They're using CP designations. Silence. Then, how long have you been tracking them? 3 days. They're moving north from the Granger Creek area. Best estimate puts them 2 to 3 days out from this location. What's their size? Unknown. At least 4 individuals based on voice count. Could be more. They're organized, have vehicles, are armed. More silence. When Reese spoke again, his voice had shifted. The tiredness was still there, but it had been compartmentalized, pushed aside by something operational, something that had its own separate drawer in him. The group you're describing, if they know about CP designations, they have access to specific program documentation. That's a significant security concern. Ryan Mack, I said. The silence this time was different, longer, precise. You should talk to Gail about that, Reese said finally. I have. Then you know what I'm dealing with. He cleared his throat. Calloway, I need you to do something that is going to feel wrong to you. I need you to secure the classified materials in that facility and not allow anyone unauthorized access. Specifically, any portable storage medium that contains copied program data. If you've found it, do not transmit it. Do not share it. Keep it secured until I can reach you, and we can discuss this with appropriate oversight. Appropriate oversight, I said. Yes. I looked at the wall in front of me, one of the communications equipment panels. I thought about what Gail had told me, about what was on the drive, about October 18th to October 21st, about the decisions made in those days. Colonel Reese, I said, I understand your concern. I want to be cooperative. But I need to tell you that I've read enough of the documentation in this facility to understand that there are competing legitimate interests here, and that my decision about the classified materials is going to depend on whether I believe those interests are being served by the course of action you're recommending. The pause was very long. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and deliberate. You're saying you're not going to blindly follow my instruction. I'm saying I'm going to use my own judgment, I said. I don't have a military rank. I don't have a clearance. I'm a civilian who found your installation and who is using it to survive, because the alternative is dying. I'll cooperate with you in everything that seems reasonable, but I'm going to need reasons, not orders. Another pause. Gail's been talking to you. Gail's told me her perspective. I'm capable of forming my own. Reese breathed out. It was a slow, controlled breath, the kind you do when you're managing your response to something. Okay, he said finally. Okay, we'll talk again in 48 hours. Keep tracking that group. Keep the facility locked down. And Calloway, he stopped. Yeah, the facility has a specific property that you need to know about, if you don't already. There's a reason we built it here, under this particular resort, at this particular location. It's not just geology and concealment. He stopped again. Go on, I said. The sublevel. Specifically, the southeast corner of the sublevel. There's a section of floor there that's reinforced, beyond what the structural requirements of the facility would normally call for. Are you aware of it? I had not specifically examined the southeast corner of the sublevel. I'd been focused on the east wall, where the maintenance crawl room was, and on the server rack. I can check it, I said. Check it, Reese said, and then we'll talk in 48 hours. He ended the call. I stood in the communications room for a moment with the satellite phone in my hand, and I thought about a specific quality of that conversation, the way Reese had deflected when I said Ryan Mack's name. Not denied, not explained. Deflected. The way you deflect when the answer is complicated enough that you're not going to give it on a phone call to someone you don't trust yet. I went to find Gail. She was in the operations room monitoring the radio traffic. I told her about the call. I told her everything Reese had said, including the part about the classified materials, and I watched her face when I told her that. And what I saw on her face was not surprise. Specifically, she wasn't surprised that Reese was asking me to secure the drive. She'd expected that. It was written in the set of her jaw. And the sublevel, I said. The southeast corner. He said there's a structural reinforcement there that's beyond what the facility normally requires. She looked at me. I know about it, she said. What is it? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that's a decision rather than a pause. Then she said, you should see it yourself, with your own eyes. You're a structural engineer. You'll understand what you're looking at better than I can explain it. We went down to the sublevel together, her moving carefully on the healing ankle. The overhead lights were on from the generator. In the southeast corner of the sublevel, the concrete floor was what it appeared to be everywhere else. Sealed, clean, featureless. I looked at the ceiling above it. Normal. I looked at the walls. Normal. Then I did what I always do, and I got down and pressed my hands flat on the floor, and I felt. And under my palms the floor vibrated, very slightly. A tremor, periodic, every 4 or 5 seconds, not the building settling. The Cascade Range did have seismic activity, minor tremors, but this was too rhythmic for tectonic activity. And it was warm, not dramatically warm, but the concrete in the southeast corner was measurably warmer than the concrete everywhere else in the sublevel. I pulled out the facility's structural diagram that I'd been carrying in my notebook, and I looked at what was drawn in the southeast corner. Nothing. The diagram showed the southeast corner as solid concrete wall and floor, but I just felt warmth and vibration in that section. There's another level, I said, below the sublevel. Yes, Gail said. I looked up at her. The sub-basement, the one in the original county inspector's notes. The load-bearing anomaly, origin unclear. The facility goes deeper than the documentation shows, she said. The sublevel is 1 level below the basement. There's another level below that. That's what Reese is telling you about. What's down there? She looked at the southeast corner of the floor, at the warmth and the vibration coming up through the concrete. That, she said, is what the program was actually for. Not climate monitoring, not even pathogen tracking. She looked at me. You know how I said the university research team was looking at infected subjects, showing slower cortical deterioration, the data they were collecting on that? Yes. They weren't just collecting field data. There was a controlled element too, below us. She said it simply, without flinching from it. And that lack of flinching told me she'd had a long time to think about this, and had gotten through the part where flinching was the right response, and arrived somewhere colder and more useful. I stood up from the floor. I thought about the warmth coming up through the concrete, about something living generating heat. They had infected subjects down there, I said, under this installation. 2, when we evacuated, she said. Both long-duration infection cases, both showing the delayed cortical deterioration pattern. The team was studying them. She paused, feeding them, keeping them alive, monitoring the progression. Are they still alive? I said. Are they still down there? She looked at the floor. I don't know. I was in the emergency refuge for 6 days. The access point to the lower level is in the generator room. I think you may have walked past it without realizing. The generator room, the fuel drums, the battery rack. I thought about every inch of that room, and then I thought about the southeast corner of that room specifically, and what was there, the concrete block wall, the perimeter, wait, the perimeter was not entirely block. There was a section of the east wall in the generator room where the block met a poured concrete section, and between those 2 sections, at floor level, there was a joint that I had noted in my initial inspection and filed as normal, a construction joint where 2 pours met. But what if it wasn't a construction joint? What if it was a door sill? I need to go look at the generator room, I said. Pete. She said my name, and there was something in it that stopped me. Not alarm, exactly. More like the sound of someone who needs you to understand the full weight of something before you move. They've been down there for 6 days without the monitoring team, without food. She let that settle for a second. Whatever they are now, whatever 6 days more of deterioration has done to whatever cognitive function they had left, they are not what they were when we evacuated. I looked at the floor, at the warmth coming up through it, the periodic vibration. Okay, I said. I'll look at the generator room wall. I won't open anything I don't understand. She looked at me steadily. You always go in. she said. You went in this building. You went in this shelter. You went in the maintenance garage. I can see it in you. You're the kind of person who opens doors. Is that a warning? I said. It's an observation, she said. One that I respect, actually. Just, she paused. Check the door is sound before you do anything else. If it's a sealed door and it's holding, and whatever's on the other side is contained, I'd rather know the door is intact than know what's behind it. That was reasonable. That was what a structural engineer would say, if a structural engineer had been in this situation. Check the load before you move the wall. I went to the generator room and I went to the east wall, and I looked at the section I'd previously filed as a construction joint. With fresh eyes, with specific intent, with the knowledge of what I was looking for. It was 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, the poured section. The joint at its left edge was clean and tight. The joint at its right edge was the same. But at the bottom, at floor level, the joint had a gap, not a wide gap, a few millimeters, but consistent across the full width of the poured section. The kind of gap that appears when a door has settled slightly on its frame over time. Not a wall, a door. There was no visible handle on this side, no hinges, no mechanism. Whatever was on the other side, this wasn't designed to be opened from here. It was designed to be opened from the other side, from below. I pressed my ear to the concrete. The warmth was coming through it here, more noticeable than in the sub-level above, more direct. And through the concrete, very faint, I heard something. Not knocking, not the rhythmic tap that Gail had been making to signal me. Something lower, continuous. A sound that you felt as much as heard. The frequency of it in the bones of the jaw when you pressed close to the concrete. A sound like breathing that had gone wrong. A sound like something that was still trying to do what breathing was for, but had forgotten why. I pulled back from the wall. I stood there for a second. Then I checked the joint again, ran my hands all the way around the edge of the poured section, looked at the sill, checked the structural integrity of the joint on all 4 sides. The door was holding. Whatever was on the other side had not compromised it. The concrete was intact. The installation was sealed. The door's sound, I called back toward the sub-level. Loud enough for Gail to hear through the trapdoor, but not loud enough, I hoped, to reach the ventilation intake and the outside. Her voice came back. Good. I went back upstairs. I sat in the operations room with my notebook, and I drew a cross-section of what I now knew this facility to be. 4 levels. Ground floor and lodge above. Basement boiler room. Sub-level operations center. And below that, connected by what appeared to be a one-way sealed door in the generator room. A sub-basement that I had not been to, and did not know the layout of, that was warm and occupied by at least 2 subjects of a research program, about which I had strong feelings. The facility diagram that Reese had been managing me toward, the document that showed only 2 levels below ground, was incomplete. It had been incomplete deliberately. The sub-basement wasn't in any of the documents available in the facility, not the maintenance manual, not the structural diagram, not the operational protocols. Whatever was down there was more classified than everything else. Gail, I said, when she came back up from checking the trapdoor. The classified materials you copied onto the drive, does that include anything about the sub-basement level? She sat down at her workstation. She was quiet for a moment, then, some, not everything. What I was able to copy in the time I had was primarily the epidemiological data and the internal communications about non-disclosure. The sub-basement protocols and research records were on a separate system, server Unit 4 in the rack, not Unit 3. And Unit 4 was wiped as part of the standard evacuation protocol. Reese wiped it before they left. Yes. So whatever they were doing down there, whatever the research was specifically, that's gone. Not entirely. She looked at her hands for a second. I have some notes. Things I wrote down from memory after I went into the refuge. I was in that room for 6 days with a lot of time to think, and I wrote down what I remembered. She looked up at me. I wasn't supposed to know about the sub-basement, clearance level, but 6 months of being in this facility and the research team moving in and out, you pick things up. You notice things. Like what? I said. Like the fact that the infection in the sub-basement subjects was showing a much slower progression than any of the field cases. much slower. And the research team had a hypothesis about why, not just about the individual's biology, but about a specific quality of the pathogen itself, a quality that was only visible in long-duration controlled cases. She looked at the structural cross-section I'd drawn, a quality that Reese thought was the most strategically important piece of information to come out of the entire program. "What quality?" I said. She looked at me. "The pathogen. In long-duration cases, 6 months, 8 months, sustained infection, seems to degrade. Not the host, the pathogen itself. It degrades in the host tissue over time, losing what the researchers were calling transmission viability. The hosts remain symptomatic, but they stop being contagious." I sat very still. "The infection has a natural endpoint," I said. The researchers weren't calling it an endpoint. They were calling it a transmission window. The window in which the pathogen can be passed to a new host is not indefinite. It's extended. Weeks, maybe months. But it ends. She said it carefully, watching my face. "The infected subjects in the sub-basement have been infected for 8+ months. If the hypothesis is correct, if the window closes, those 2 people down there are not currently transmissible." I thought about the woman in the parking lot. About 17 infected in the lot on day 1. I thought about the smoke from Granger Creek, and about a town of 3,000, and about a county and a state and a country beyond that. "If the transmission window closes," I said, "then the infection burns itself out. Eventually, in the currently infected population, new transmission stops. The infected remain, symptomatic, mobile, cognitively devastated, but they stop spreading it." She paused. "The problem is the word eventually. The researchers estimated, based on the animal data and the sub-basement cases, that the median transmission window was somewhere between 3 and 6 months from initial infection, which means the people who were infected earliest, in October, late September, are approaching the outer edge of that window right now. 3 to 6 months. It was late October. People infected in early October were maybe 3 weeks into a 3 to 6 month window. And Reese wanted this information controlled," I said. "Reese," she said carefully, "has reasons for everything. Some of those reasons I understand and respect. The concern about releasing preliminary data before it's confirmed is legitimate. If people hear that the infection burns itself out in 6 months, some of them will try to survive in place for 6 months without taking adequate protective measures, and they'll die. That's a real concern." She picked up her coffee cup. "But the internal communications on the drive, the ones between Reese and the federal contacts, the concern they're expressing is not primarily about premature public release. It's about what a confirmed transmission window means for the government's authority framework post-outbreak. If the infected population becomes non-transmissible on a known timeline, the survival calculus for civilians changes. The dependency on organized government response changes. The people who hold information about the timeline hold something very close to a form of power." I said nothing for a moment. I was a structural engineer. I looked at load paths, at the way forces moved through a structure, at where the load concentrated and where it dispersed. And what she was describing was a load path of a specific kind, information as a structural force, and Reese and the people above him trying to control where that force went and how much of it reached the people below. "You sent the drive data to your contact on HF," I said. "The epidemiological data and the internal communications." "Yes. The transmission window hypothesis is, it's not confirmed. I sent what I had, not speculation." She paused. "But yes. It's gone. It's out there now, wherever he can take it. Reese is going to know that when he gets here." "Yes." She said it without any drama, like she'd made peace with the consequences 6 days ago in an 8x6 room with a twisted ankle. That night, day 7, the night after the call from Reese and the discovery in the generator room and Gail's account of the transmission window, I lay on my bunk in the dim dormitory, and I did not sleep for a long time. Not because I was afraid, or not primarily because of that, because I was thinking about structure, about the 4-level cross-section I'd drawn in my notebook, the building I was living in, and the things it was holding up and the things it was keeping down. About the loads on the system, Reese with his authority and his managed information, the group moving north on the tactical frequency toward this location. Gail and her drive and her 6 days of solitary thinking. The 2 research subjects in the warm sub-basement below my feet, degrading slowly, approaching some threshold. Every building I'd ever worked in was trying to tell you something. Load goes somewhere. Force follows a path. You read the structure and you find where the path goes, and then you understand the building. You can't design around a load you haven't identified. I was beginning to understand this building. Around 1 in the morning, the satellite phone in the communications room rang once. Just once. A single ring, and then stopped. Not long enough to be a call. A signal. A prearranged signal. The kind of thing you do when you want to alert someone without speaking. Like a knock on a wall. Like 3 taps and then 2. I got up and went to the communications room. The phone showed 1 missed call. No voicemail. No number. The caller had blocked their ID. Not Reese. Reese used the same number every time. I sat in the communications room chair, and I looked at the satellite phone, and I thought about who else had this number, and the answer was, no one I'd given it to. I'd left it on the voicemail to FEMA and to Greg Holt's cell. Either of them could have passed it on. But a single ring, no message, at 1 in the morning, that wasn't FEMA, and that wasn't Greg Holt. That was someone who knew I was here, and was telling me they knew. Outside, the Cascades were dark and cold, and the access road that led up to this mountain went south, toward Granger Creek, and then further south, and somewhere on that road or near it, a group of organized people with vehicles and weapons and tactical frequency knowledge and quite possibly Ryan Mack were moving toward me at whatever pace the road allowed. The group was still 2 days out, by Gail's estimate. Maybe 3. Maybe less, if they pushed. I turned the lights down in the communications room to save battery load, and I went back to the operations room, and I sat at the desk, and I started drawing a second map. Not the facility cross-section. This was a surface map. The resort grounds, the parking lot, the service road, the maintenance garage, the access road, the tree lines, the slope rising above toward the peak. Everything I'd observed. All the infected positions I'd been tracking. The sight lines from the upper lodge windows, the distances. I drew it carefully, and I thought about the load path, where the force was going to come from, how it was going to move through the structure, where it was going to concentrate, what needed to be reinforced before it arrived. I thought about the crossbow leaning against the wall in the communications room. I thought about the 14 locked equipment cases in the sublevel. I thought about the 2 subjects below the generator room floor who were potentially approaching the end of their transmission window, still moving, still warm, still down there in the dark. I thought about what Gail had said, "You always go in." She was right, I do. And the question for day 8 was not whether to go in, but where and how and what to bring. I made one more entry in my notebook before I slept. Day 7, late. Phone rang once, no ID. 2 days, possibly less. The building knows what's coming before the people in it do. Read the structure, load path. Find the weak points and reinforce them, same as always. I went to sleep with the crossbow next to the bunk and the Glock on the shelf. The ventilation system ran quietly, pulling pine-scented mountain air from the slope above. Somewhere below me, in the warm, sealed dark of the sub-basement, 2 people who used to be something else moved slowly in their space and made the sound I'd heard through the concrete wall, the sound that was like breathing, trying to remember what it was for. And 2 days north of Granger Creek, headlights moved on a mountain road in the dark, and whoever was driving them already knew where they were going. Day 8 started with snow, not a lot, just enough to notice. A thin scatter of flakes coming through the ventilation intake, visible as a faint mineral smell in the air, before I even got to the window to look. When I went upstairs to do the morning count, the parking lot had a dusting on it, a 1/4 inch at most, and the infected were moving through it without any apparent awareness of the change. Their feet left tracks, shuffling, irregular, dragging in places. And the tracks were the most information I'd gotten about their movement patterns because now I could see everywhere they'd been, not just where they were standing when I looked. The snow was like reading a history. 2 of them had circled my truck twice during the night. One had gone to the main entrance doors and stood there for what the track depth suggested was a long time, the snow compressed into a thin crust by repeated small shifts of weight. I stood at the upper hallway window and looked at that track for a while. The compressed snow in front of the main entrance doors. Then I went back downstairs and I didn't say anything about it to Gail yet because I wanted to think about it first. And thinking about things before I spoke them was a habit I'd developed over 15 years of giving structural assessments to clients who wanted to hear specific things and needed to hear other things instead. The drone was the priority for day 8. I'd assembled it the day before. The components in the case were well packaged and included a detailed assembly guide, and I'd charged the batteries on the generator's USB output overnight. It was a DJI variant, military modified, with a thermal imaging sensor added alongside the standard optical camera. The controller had a range of roughly 3 kilometers in clear conditions, less in the trees. I'd decided to fly it at first light, when the temperature was coldest and the thermals off the mountain were minimal, which would give me the most stable imaging. The problem with flying it was noise. Drone propellers are not quiet. The infected in the parking lot would hear it the moment it cleared the roof, and they'd start moving toward the sound. I needed to account for that. Launch from a position that directed the initial noise away from the main cluster in the parking lot. Climb fast and high to get above the sound horizon quickly, and accept that the lot would be disrupted for however long the flight took. I flew it from the second floor east wing window, which faced away from the parking lot toward the tree line and the slope. The window opened inward, and I got it to about an 8-inch gap and launched through the gap, the drone clearing the window frame with about 2 inches to spare. Cold immediately. The drone's camera feed came up on the controller screen, a live image of the resort grounds as the drone climbed. What I saw on that screen changed the shape of what I thought I was dealing with. The resort property was bigger than what I could see from the windows. The drone gave me the full picture. Main lodge, parking lot, maintenance garage, that I knew. What I hadn't been able to see from the windows, the east slope of the property, where the ski runs came down from the peak, had more infected on it than I'd estimated. The thermal sensor picked them up as warm shapes against the cold ground. I counted from the thermal image, taking my time, making sure I wasn't double counting. 29 infected on the resort property, and immediately surrounding it, not 17. The ones I couldn't see from the windows were distributed along the tree line, and the lower ski run, mostly stationary, some moving slowly south. I flew the drone south, following the access road down the mountain. The road switchbacked through the trees, a narrow 2-lane, with the mountain on one side and a drop on the other. About 1.5 miles down, the drone's camera picked up what I was looking for: vehicles. 3 of them, parked at a wide spot on the road where a forestry pullout gave enough space to get off the main surface. 2 pickup trucks, 1 dark green, 1 black, and a white cargo van. They were not moving. They were parked, which meant whoever was in them had stopped for the night, which meant they were not 2 days out from the previous estimate. They were 90 minutes out, at most. I flew the drone close enough to get a good optical image of the vehicles. The green truck had a camper shell on the back. The van's rear doors were open, and I could see shapes inside. Gear, bags, something that might have been a person lying down. A man stood at the edge of the pullout with his back to the drop, looking up the mountain. And even at drone resolution, even at that distance, the way he stood told me he was not just looking at scenery. He was calculating. I held the drone steady for about 15 seconds and got what I needed, then brought it back before the battery got below 40%. I went to Gail. "They're on the road," I said. "About 1.5 miles down. 3 vehicles, parked overnight. They'll be moving when the light gets better." She absorbed that without any change in her expression. "How many people?" Couldn't get an accurate count from the drone. At least 6 bodies accounted for in and around the vehicles, possibly more in the van. "What kind of weapons did you see?" "1 visible long gun on the man standing at the pullout. Sling carried. Looked like an AR pattern. Couldn't confirm others." She thought for a second. 6 to 8 people, at least 1 AR, parked 1.5 miles down, ready to move at first light. She looked at the operations room ceiling. "So we have maybe 2 hours, maybe less. Then we need to decide what we want right now, before they get here. Because once they're in the lodge and they've found the basement, there's not a lot of decision-making left." She looked at me. "Options. We could run, I said. Snowcat from the maintenance garage. Go up the mountain instead of down. Try to find another route out. Through 29 infected on the property. Yes. In daylight. With a diesel engine running. Yes. She didn't say anything. We could stay down here and let them search the lodge, I said. If they don't find the pivot door, they'll eventually leave. And if they have Ryan Mack with them, and he knows exactly where the pivot block is, then that doesn't work. Third option, she said. We talk to them, I said. She looked at me. Yeah. Not from a position of openness, I said. From a position of negotiation. We know something they want. The location of the installation. What's in it? How to access the systems. We make ourselves useful before they can make us a problem. That only works, she said, if what they want is actually what we can give them. If what they want is the drive, then we have a different conversation. She was quiet for a moment. Ryan will be trying to control this. He's been managing them, whoever they are, guiding them here. His argument to them is probably that the installation has resources, food, medicine, shelter. And he's not wrong, it does. But his actual goal is to get the drive back, or eliminate the copy, or both. She paused. The question is how much the rest of the group knows about that. How much Ryan has told them, versus how much he's been managing them, the way Reese manages everyone. That was a specific and useful thing to know before they arrived. I thought about how to get it. The radio, I said. They've been transmitting on the tactical frequency, unencrypted. What if we transmit back? Not as us. Not identifying the installation. Just as a civilian on the same frequency. Try to get a read on their composition and intent before they know we're here. She looked at me for a second. Then she went to the communications room. What she did was professional and quick. And I watched her do it, and thought again about what kind of person spends 6 days in an 8x6 room and comes out moving and thinking like this. She tuned to the frequency she'd been monitoring, keyed the transmitter on the lowest power setting, and broadcast a short message in a flat, exhausted civilian voice. The kind of voice that required very little acting given the circumstances. She said she was a survivor at Creston Peak. She'd been sheltering in the lodge for several days. She'd heard traffic on this frequency. She didn't know who was out there, but she was asking for help. She released the key and we waited. For 2 minutes there was nothing. Then a burst of static and a voice. Male, mid-30s, calm, but with an edge to it. He said, Creston Peak. This is the Granger Creek Relief Group. We copy you. How many in your party? Relief Group. I noted the name, the branding of it, naming themselves a relief group. Gale keyed again. 2. I'm injured. We have some food, but we're running low. Please. Are you coming this way? A pause. Then the same voice. We're about a mile south of your location. We can be there in an hour. Can you signal your position? Gale looked at me. I shook my head. Don't give them any more than they need. She keyed. I'm in the main lodge. I can be at the entrance. Another pause. This one longer. Then the voice said, Copy that. Stay put. We'll be there. And then, in the background of his transmission, before he fully released his key, just a fragment, just a second, a different voice, quieter, saying something I couldn't fully catch. 2 words, maybe 3. The second word sounded like it might have been shelter. Gale heard it too. I saw it on her face. We had 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I used 20 of them doing something I should have done on day 1, and hadn't, because I'd been managing one discovery at a time, and hadn't gotten to it yet. I went through the locked desk drawers with a pry bar. 3 of the 6 workstations had locked bottom drawers that I hadn't been able to open. The pry bar took about 4 minutes per drawer. What was in them was not what I expected. I'd expected more operational files, more classified documents. What I found instead was personal. Notebooks, handwritten. Not official logs, personal notebooks, the kind you buy at a drugstore. 4 of them, belonging to 2 different people based on the handwriting. One set was in a careful blocky print, the other in a loose slanted cursive. I didn't have time to read them properly. I scanned. The blocky print notebook. I found a name inside the front cover, first name only, Ryan. Ryan Mack's personal notebook, left in the locked drawer during the evacuation. I flipped through it quickly, looking for anything that stood out. Most of it was daily entries about the work, technical observations. Then, near the back, the entries changed in tone. The last 6 entries, written in what I estimated was the final 2 weeks before the evacuation, were different. Shorter, more terse, the handwriting tighter. They read like someone who was scared but refusing to let the fear show in the words, compressing it instead. One entry 3 days before the evacuation said, "Told R again that the model is wrong. Not the data, the interpretation. The window isn't a solution. It's a variable. What closes the window? We don't know. What if the window resets under certain conditions? We don't have the long-term data. She's treating a preliminary result like a confirmed endpoint, and I can't make her understand why that's dangerous." She was Gale. He was arguing that the transmission window hypothesis wasn't solid enough to release as actionable information. The last entry, dated the day of the evacuation. Decision made. Taking the drive. She'll copy it anyway if she gets the chance, and I can't stop that. But I can at least make sure Unit 4 is clean. If we're wrong about the window, if we're wrong, and people start believing the infection ends in 6 months, and they stop taking protective measures, and the infection doesn't end, or it doesn't end predictably, or it resets, the number of people who die because of a preliminary hypothesis treated as confirmed fact is... He hadn't finished the sentence. The pen line went long off the last word, which suggested he'd been interrupted or had just stopped. Below it, in the margin, very small. "She's right that they need to know. I just don't know that they need to know this yet." I put the notebook in my jacket pocket, and I went back to Gale. "Ryan's concern about the transmission window," I said. "It wasn't about protecting Reese. It was about the hypothesis not being confirmed. He was worried that releasing preliminary data would cause more deaths than withholding it." She looked at me. "I know that's what he believed. But you released it anyway. Because not releasing confirmed data, the epidemiological data, the internal communications, because not releasing that was going to cause more deaths. The two things are separable, Pete. The story of what was done and the hypothesis about the window are two different pieces of information. I released the story. The window hypothesis went out with it because they're in the same files, and I didn't have time to cleanly separate them. Ryan knows that's what I did. He's not wrong that it was imperfect." She paused. "But Reese is also not wrong that the information is dangerous. And Reese is also not innocent of the decisions that made this an emergency instead of a managed response. Those 3 things are all true simultaneously." "And the group coming up the road," I said, "doesn't know any of this," she said. "They know there's a facility with resources. They know Ryan can find it. They're desperate people being led by someone who has his own agenda and is trying to reconcile that agenda with their survival needs." She looked at the window. "Which means they're unpredictable. And that's the most dangerous kind of situation." We spent the remaining 20 minutes doing specific things. I went up to the main floor of the lodge, and I unlocked the main entrance doors. That was deliberate. I needed to control where they came in, and from which direction. And the main entrance gave me the best visibility. I left the crossbow downstairs in the shelter, and I kept the Glock in my waistband under my jacket. I moved 3 of the restaurant chairs into the lobby in a specific arrangement, 2 facing the entrance from about 20 feet back, 1 off to the side. A staging for a conversation rather than a confrontation, but with geometry that let me move quickly if I needed to. I put water bottles on the chairs and an open MRE package on the table between them. Then I went back downstairs and spoke to Gale. "I'm going to meet them upstairs," I said. "In the lobby. You stay down here. Keep the pivot panel closed. Keep monitoring the radio." She looked at the direction of the armory. "Take the second Glock." "I've got 1. "Take both." She said it without drama. 2 is 1, 1 is none. You know where I heard that? Ryan Mack, actually. First week at the installation. She went to the armory and came back with the second Glock and 2 spare magazines. If Ryan is up there and he sees me, it complicates the negotiation immediately. Let him think he's talking to just you first. He doesn't know you exist. That's an advantage. And if they get past me, they won't find the pivot panel without knowing exactly what they're looking for. She said it steadily, and I appreciated that she was choosing confidence, even if neither of us was certain it was warranted. If they get past you, I'll hear them in the basement and I'll have the panel secured and I'll wait you out. The shelter holds. I thought about Ryan Mack's notebook entry. She's right that they need to know. I just don't know that they need to know this yet. A man who disagreed with Gail's methods but not her fundamental goal. Whatever he'd done in the weeks since the evacuation, that entry had been written the day he left. There might be a deal here that works for everyone, I said. There might be. She looked at me with that careful, reading expression she had. But go in knowing it might not be. Go in ready for the version that doesn't work. I always go in ready for the structure to be worse than the report says it is, I said. That's basically the job description. The corners of her mouth moved. Then she said, "Come back down in one piece." I went upstairs. They arrived in 51 minutes from the radio contact, which was faster than the hour they'd estimated. And the reason it was faster became apparent when I heard the vehicles. Not on the access road, but already in the parking lot. Which meant they'd driven the last section without stopping. Which meant they'd been closer than 1.5 miles when we made radio contact. They'd been staged, ready to move. I was standing in the lobby when the main entrance doors opened, and the first person through was not who I expected. He was young, maybe 22, wearing a heavy North Face jacket and carrying an AR-15 in a way that suggested he'd recently learned to carry it rather than grown up with one. Behind him came 2 women, one in her 40s with a burn on the left side of her face that was recent and partly treated. One younger with a child on her back in a carrier, the child maybe 18 months old, asleep. Behind them a large man, broad, thick through the shoulders, wearing canvas work clothing, who was looking at everything in the lobby with a slow, methodical scan, and behind him, last through the door, moving with a slight hesitation that had nothing to do with physical injury, Ryan Mack. I recognized him from the family photo in the dormitory. Not the photo itself. That was a woman and 2 kids. But the photo had been face down on his bunk, which meant it had been significant enough to bring and significant enough to leave. And the quality of someone who carries that specific weight showed in a person's face, once you knew what you were looking for. Ryan Mack was 40-something, lean, with the kind of face that had been weathered by time outdoors and by whatever the past month had done to him. He was not carrying a visible weapon. He saw me standing in the lobby, and his face did something careful and controlled. "You're the one on the radio," said the young man with the AR. "Pete Calloway," I said. "I'm a structural engineer. I was doing an assessment on this building when the outbreak started. I've been here for 8 days. The young man with the AR. His name turned out to be Brent, and he was the speaker I'd heard on the radio, the one who'd identified the group as the Granger Creek Relief Group, looked me over. He had the kind of directness that was either natural confidence or anxiety, channeling itself as aggression, and from the way his grip on the AR was a little too tight, I suspected the latter. "Just you here?" "Just me," I said. Ryan Mack was looking at the lobby, at the chairs I'd arranged, at the water bottles and the open MRE. He was doing the same calculation I'd done when I first walked into the operations room, reading the space, reading what the space said about the person who'd arranged it. "Structural engineer," he said. He had a quiet, precise voice, a voice that belonged to someone who chose words carefully. "Building assessment." "That's right. You found the basement," he said. Not a question. "I found the basement," I said. "Boiler room. Old equipment. Nothing functional." He looked at me with an expression that was not quite what I'd expected. Not adversarial. Not the look of someone calling me out on a lie. More like the look of someone who was receiving information he needed to make a calculation. "That's all you found," he said. "That's all I found," I said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Pete, I'm Ryan Mack. I was with a research team that worked in this area until about a week ago. I'm guessing you have some questions about what you found in that basement." The careful honesty of it surprised me. Not full honesty. He was managing the room the same way I was, but he was not pretending he didn't know what was in the building, which meant he wasn't afraid of what I knew, which meant he thought what he knew was more comprehensive than what I knew. He didn't know about Gail. "I have questions," I said. "Sit down. There's food and water. Your people look like they need to sit." The woman with the child on her back looked at the water bottles, and something in her face broke very briefly. She sat down fast, the child still asleep against her back, and she opened a water bottle and drank half of it before she remembered manners and looked at me and said, "Thank you." Her name was Claire. The child's name, she told me, was Lena. They were from Harlan, the next county over from Granger Creek, and they had been moving since October 24th, which was the day after I'd arrived at the resort. 2 days before I found the shelter, they had been on the road. The older woman with the burn on her face was named Pat. She had been a nurse practitioner in Granger Creek. She didn't offer the story of the burn, and I didn't ask. The large man was Doug, who had been a contractor, and who had apparently been the one to maintain physical order in the group when Brent's anxiety got ahead of his judgment. There were 3 more people outside in the vehicles, 2 men and a woman, whom Brent described as keeping watch. Ryan Mack sat in the chair across from mine and folded his hands on his knee and looked at me with the careful, precise attention of someone who was very good at assessment. "You've been here 8 days, he said. 8 days. You've eaten. You look rested. Your jacket's clean, which means you haven't been sleeping in it." He looked at the MRE packaging. "You have supplies." "I found supplies in the kitchen," I said. The resort had a partial inventory that wasn't cleared out when it closed. Kitchen supplies from a place closed 7 years ago. Some of it was non-perishable. He looked at me for another moment. He was deciding something. Then he said, quietly, so that Brent and Doug and Pat were not quite in the conversation anymore, "Pete, I'm not here to take anything from you. I want you to know that. Whatever you've found, wherever your supplies are actually coming from, I'm not here to take it. These people need shelter and food for a few days. A safe place to rest. That's what I told them was here, and that's what I'm trying to deliver." "And what do you need?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman on my team who stayed behind when we evacuated. I've been trying to get back to this location for 6 days and I haven't been able to. Because..." He stopped, looked at the lobby ceiling briefly. "It's been a difficult 6 days. I need to know if she survived." That was a careful way to say it. A woman on my team, not Gail's name, not any detail that would tell me how much he knew. He was checking my response for tells. He was a scientist. He was running an experiment on me. I looked at him steadily. "What's her name?" The pause before he answered was the most honest moment in the conversation so far. "Gail Tanner." "I've been in this building for 8 days, I said. "I haven't seen anyone else." He nodded. His face did that thing again. The controlled receiving of information. He'd been afraid she was dead. That much I could read. The control was covering grief, or the readiness for grief. "Tell me about the group," I said. "Where you came from. What happened. I want to understand the situation outside before I make any decisions about what happens here." So he did. Quietly, with the others in the lobby gradually relaxing and eating and drinking. Pat had opened the second MRE without asking, and I'd nodded at it to indicate it was fine. Ryan told me what had happened in the 12 days since the evacuation. It was not a simple story. It was the kind of story that happens when a very bad situation finds people who are trying to do the right thing but have different and incompatible definitions of what the right thing is. He had evacuated with 3 other team members and Reese in 2 vehicles. Reese had immediately moved to execute what Ryan called the containment protocol, which meant going to ground, maintaining radio silence on public frequencies, and managing information flow from isolated locations. Ryan had agreed with the protocol in principle, and disagreed with it in practice, specifically in the practice of driving through Granger Creek and Harlan on the way out and not stopping. Not stopping when there were people on the roadside who needed help. Not broadcasting what they knew about the infection. Not sharing the resources in the vehicles, medical supplies, food, with anyone who was not cleared program personnel. Reese made the decision, Ryan said. I disagreed, and I said so, and then I followed the order. Because I had enough discipline to understand that unilateral deviation in a crisis produces its own cascade of problems. He said it flatly. And then we stopped at a fueling point, and Brent was there, and some of the others, and they asked if we had medical supplies, and I got out of the vehicle, and I gave them what I had in my kit, and Reese told me to get back in the vehicle, and I said no. Reese had driven away. Ryan had stayed. He left you, I said. He made a tactical decision, Ryan said, not quite defending it, not quite condemning it. He was managing a situation. From his perspective, I was a contaminated node. He paused. We'd had the argument about the drive. about what Gail had done. He knew I'd been in contact with her about it, and he knew I hadn't supported her choice, but I hadn't fully opposed it either, and in his framework that made me unreliable. Another pause. He's not wrong about everything, Reese. He's wrong about some things that matter enormously, but his caution isn't invented. The situation with the transmission window data, releasing preliminary results as if they were confirmed, that's a real problem. People are already making decisions based on information Gail broadcast that I believe was premature. I've heard it on the radio. People staying in place, not moving. Wante, because they heard there's an infection window and it's closing. Waiting it out. Some of those people are in positions where waiting is going to get them killed regardless of the infection. I thought about what he'd written in his notebook. What closes the window? We don't know. What if the window resets under certain conditions? The window hypothesis, I said. You think it's wrong? I think it's not confirmed, he said. There's a difference. The animal data supported it. The controlled cases supported it. But the controlled cases are a sample size of 2, and one of those cases had an anomalous infection history that the team hadn't fully accounted for. He looked at his hands. I'm a scientist. I know the difference between a preliminary finding and a confirmed result. Gail knows the difference too. She made a judgment that the preliminary finding was important enough to release because of the context, because of what was in those internal communications alongside it. And I understand why she made that judgment. He stopped. I keep thinking about the people who hear 6 months, and wait 6 months, and the window doesn't close for them, or doesn't close when they think it does. Are you saying the window doesn't exist? I'm saying we don't know that it exists with the certainty that the release implied. He looked at me directly. And I'm saying the only way to know with any confidence is to have the data from the sub-basement cases, which I don't have, because I don't have access to the installation. He paused, which is why I came back here. The lobby was quiet except for the small sounds of people eating and the distant, occasional muted noise from outside. Lena had woken up on Claire's back and was making small, sleepy sounds. Doug had found a chair against the wall and looked like a man who could fall asleep sitting up. You want to go into the installation? I said. I want to check on the subjects in the sub-basement, Ryan said. I want to collect whatever data the monitoring systems have been recording for the past 6 days, and I want to know if Gail is alive. He said the last thing without breaking stride, without making it more important than the first 2 things, but it was... I looked at him for a long moment. This is what I thought, sitting across from Ryan Mack in the cold lobby of an abandoned ski resort. I thought about load paths. I thought about a man who had disagreed with his colleagues' methods, followed orders he didn't believe in, abandoned those orders when they required a specific cruelty, and spent 12 days in a disintegrating world trying to get back to a place that might contain the answer to a question that could, if correctly answered, tell the survivors of this catastrophe something true and useful about their future. He was not the enemy. He had not been leading this group to strip the installation. He had been leading them toward shelter, with a secondary purpose of finishing his work. And his work, whatever its methodological imperfections, was the kind of work that mattered in the most immediate and concrete sense possible. Come with me, I said. Brent started to stand up. I looked at him. Just Ryan, I said. The rest of you stay here. Pat, are you medically trained? Pat looked up from the MRE she'd been eating. Nurse practitioner. Yes. There are medical supplies in this building. I'll show you where. While I talked to Ryan, I looked at Doug. Anyone outside gets inside, closes the vehicles, and stays in this building. I don't want engine noise drawing attention. Doug nodded. He was the kind of man who took practical instructions from practical people without needing the full reasoning behind them. I took Ryan Mack to the basement. He found the pivot mechanism on his own. I walked him to the northeast corner of the boiler room and he looked at the stack bond section and he pressed the right block and turned it without me saying anything. He'd done this hundreds of times. The panel swung and we went through the corridor to the steel door and I opened it. The fluorescent lights were on. The operations room was lit and clean and full of all its proper equipment and its pinned maps and its whiteboard with the evac notation. Ryan Mack walked into it and stood in the center and looked around with the expression of someone returning to a place that had occupied a significant portion of their inner life for months and it was not a simple expression. Then Gail came through the dormitory doorway, the moment when they saw each other. I watched it, and I'm going to try to describe it accurately. It was not a warm reunion. It was not hostile either. It was the specific look of two people who have had a serious, consequential disagreement, and who are each simultaneously relieved the other is alive, and unsure how to reconcile that relief with the disagreement. Ryan's face did something that pulled in several directions at once. Gail's face went quiet in a way that was its own kind of response. "You're okay," he said. "Ankle," she said. "Getting better." A pause. "You came back." "I said I would." "You also said I was making a mistake." "You were," he said. "I'm still here." She looked at him for another second. Then she nodded. A small, definitive nod. The kind that closes a parenthesis. Not agreeing. Acknowledging. "The sub-basement," Ryan said, turning to the room. "To me, not to Gail." "How long have you known about it?" "Day 7, I said. Heard something through the floor. Felt the thermal signature. Haven't been down. I need to go down," he said. "Today. Right now." He looked at the operations room. "Has the monitoring system been running?" "Generator's been on daily. 4 hours, roughly. The systems have been pulling power." He went to the workstation in the back left corner, the one that had been showing an amber LED since day 1. He sat down and began working the keyboard. The monitor came up showing a data interface that was beyond my ability to parse, but that Ryan was navigating with the quick precision of someone who'd spent months on it. His face, as he scrolled through the data, was focused in the specific way of someone who has been dreading and hoping for a particular result in equal parts, and is now finding out which one it is. After about 4 minutes, he stopped. He sat very still, looking at the screen. Then he said, 8 months, 3 weeks, 2 days. He said it quietly, to the screen. They hit the window, both of them. "The transmission window," I said. "Yes."